Chapter 8. Startling News. 3 weeks after Ralph's departure to join his regiment, Mrs. Conway received a letter which gave her a great shock. It was from Mrs. Withers, and was as follows: My dear Mrs. Conway, I have very sad news to tell you. An event has happened which will, I know, be as afflicting to you as it has been to us. Our dear friend Mr. Penfold, who but 3 weeks ago was so bright and happy with us in London, has passed away suddenly. Up to the day before yesterday he seemed in his usual health, but yesterday morning he did not appear at breakfast, and the servant, on going up to his room, found him sitting in a chair by his bedside, dead. The bed had not been slept in, and it appears as if before commencing to undress he had been seized with a sudden faintness, and had sunk into the chair and died without being able to summon assistance. His death is a terrible shock to us, as it will be to you. My husband and I have long been aware that our dear friend suffered from disease of the heart, and that the doctor he consulted in London had told him that his death might take place at any moment. At the same time, he had been so bright and cheerful in London, as indeed with us he was at all times, that his death comes almost with as great a surprise to us as if we had not known that he was in danger. Mr. Talboys, the solicitor of Weymouth, who managed Mr. Penfold's affairs, called here last night. The funeral is to take place on Thursday, and had Ralph been in England, he said he should have written to him to come down to it, which he could have done, of course, in time, had he started immediately. He received the letter announcing the event, but as he is over in Ireland, of course, nothing can be done. He said that had Ralph come he should have suggested that you also should be present at the reading of the will, but that as matters stand he did not think there was any occasion to trouble you. I should tell you that Mr. Talboy appeared a good deal worried, and one of his reasons for calling was to ask my husband whether he knew where Mr. Penfold was in the habit of keeping his papers. It seems that upon the day after his return from London, Mr. Penfold called upon him and took away his will, saying that he wanted to look over it, as he had 2 or 3 slight alterations that he wanted to make, and he'd bring it back in the course of a day or two, and get him to make the changes required. From that time Mr. Penfold had not been in Weymouth, and indeed had scarcely left the house except to come down here, for, as he said to my husband, he did not feel quite himself, and supposed it was a reaction after his late dissipations. Mr. Talboys, who is one of the executors named in the will, had searched for it in the afternoon among Mr. Penfold's papers, but found that it and several other documents, leases and so on, of importance, were all missing. He had asked Miss Penfold if she knew where her brother was in the habit of keeping important papers, but she replied shortly that she knew nothing whatever of her brother's business matters. He had therefore driven over to ask my husband, knowing how intimate he had been with poor Herbert. He knew, it seems, that Mr. Penfold had some secure place for such papers, because he had one day spoken to him upon the subject, saying it would be more prudent for him to leave the leases in the strong box in his office at Weymouth. But Herbert replied that they were stowed away in a far safer place, and that he had not the least fear in the world of their being stolen. Now this is just what my husband knew also. Once, when they were chatting together, Herbert mentioned that the house, like many other old mansions, contained a secret chamber. He said, "I can't tell you where it is, Withers, for although it's never likely to be used again, the knowledge of this hiding place has been passed down from generation to generation as a family secret. I gave a solemn promise never to reveal it when I was first informed of its existence, and although in these days there is no occasion to hide priests or conspirators, I did not consider myself released from the promise I gave. Possibly some day the hiding place may prove of value again. There may be a price set on the head of a Penfold, who can tell? Anyway, it's likely to remain a secret as long as the old house stands, and in the meantime I find it a useful place for keeping things that I do not want lying about." Mr. Talboys appeared very vexed at hearing what my husband said. "It's very strange," he said, "that sensible men will do such foolish things. It's probable enough that Herbert Penfold has placed this will in the hiding place you speak of, and in that case I foresee that we shall have no end of trouble. I know you are both aware of the nature of Mr. Penfold's will, and you may be sure that if those sisters of his also know of it, whether they do or not I can't say, they will bitterly resent it. I know enough of the family history to know that. It was evident by Miss Penfold's answer to me today that either she does not know the secret of this hiding place, which is of course possible, or that she does know but does not mean to say. I should imagine myself that she does know. Had Herbert Penfold been of age when his father died, it's likely enough that he only, as head of the family, would have been told by his father of its existence. But you see he was but a lad at the time, while the Miss Penfolds were women, and were therefore probably informed of the secret. It was very awkward, extremely awkward. Of course the will may turn up between this and the funeral, but if not, I hardly know what steps had best be taken. If those Penfold women have made up their minds that this will shall not see the light, they are likely to carry it through to the end. My husband quite agreed with Mr. Tallboys about that, and so do I. I've never been able to abide them, though, as my husband says, they are good women in many respects, and always ready to help in parish matters. Still, I can't abide them, nor am I sure have you any reason to do so. For when I and my husband first came here, we learned a good deal of the part they had played in a certain matter, and that, of course, set me altogether against them. Of course, my dear Mrs. Conway, I do not wish to alarm you about the will. Still, you ought to know how things stand, and my husband this morning asked me to tell you all there was to tell. I hope in a few days to be able to write and give you better news. Things may not be as they fear." Mrs. Conway sat for a long time with the letter before her. She had not read it straight through, but after glancing at the first few lines that told of the death of Herbert Penfold, she had laid it aside, and it was a long time before she took it up again. He had been the love of her youth, and although he had seemingly gone for so many years out of her life, she knew that when she had found how he had all this time watched over her and so delicately aided her, and that for her sake he was going to make Ralph his heir, her old feeling had been revived. Not that she had any thought that the past would ever return. His letters, indeed, had shown that he regarded his life as approaching its end, but since the receipt of that letter she had always thought of him with a tender affection, as one who might have been her husband had not either evil fate or malice stepped in to prevent it. The fortnight they had spent in London had brought them very close together. He had assumed the footing of a brother, but she had felt that, pleasant and kind as he was to all the rest of the party, it was for her sake alone that this festivity had been arranged. They had had but one talk together alone, and she had then said that she hoped the expressions he had used in his letter to her with reference to his health were not altogether justified, for he seemed so bright and well. He had shaken his head quietly and said, "It's just as well that you should know, Mary. I've seen my physician since I came up to town, and I don't think it will last much longer. A little time ago I did not wish it to last. Now I should be glad to go on until I can see my little scheme realized, but I'm quite sure that it's not to be. Anyhow, I'm ready to go when I'm summoned, and am happy in the thought that the few people I care for are all in a fair way to be happy. Don't cry, dear. I don't want a single cloud to hang over our memories of this time. I am happier than I have ever been in my life, and I want you and all of them to be very happy too. I've set my mind upon that, and if I see a cloud on your face it will spoil it all." Still, in spite of this, she had hoped the doctor might have taken too gloomy a view of the case, and that Herbert Penfold's death might yet be a distant event. And now it was all over. Herbert Penfold was dead. The heart that had beat so kindly for her was silenced forever. It was then a long time before Mrs. Conway recovered sufficiently from her emotion to take up the letter again. She did so with an air almost of indifference. She had learned the news, and doubtless all this long epistle contained many details of comparatively little interest. But as she read, her air of languid grief gave way to an expression of keen interest, and she skimmed through the last page or two with anxious haste. Then she reread it more slowly and carefully, and then, throwing it on the table, stood up and walked up and down the little room. So these women, who had, as she believed, ruined her life and Herbert's, were now going to attack her son and rob him of his rights. They should not do it if she could help it. Never. Mary Vernon had been a high-spirited girl, and although those who had only known her through her widowhood would have taken her for a gentle and quiet woman, those thoughts were entirely wrapped up in her boy. The old spirit was alive yet, as with head thrown back and an angry flush on her cheek she declared to herself that she would defend Ralph's rights to the last. How or in what manner she did not ask. She only knew that those who would defraud him were her old enemies. Had it been otherwise, the fact that they were Herbert's sisters would have softened her toward them. Now that fact only added to the hostility she bore them. They, his nearest relatives of blood, had ruined his life. Now they would defeat his dying wishes. It should not be if she could help it. She would fight against it to the last day of her life. There was, of course, nothing to be done yet, nothing until she had heard again, nothing until she knew that the discovery of the will was given up as hopeless. Then it would be time for her to do something. The thought barely occurred to her that the loss of this will might make material difference in her own circumstances, and that the allowance Herbert Penfold had made her, and which he had doubtless intended she should continue to receive, would cease. That was so secondary a consideration that it at present gave her no trouble. It was of Ralph, she thought, of Ralph and Herbert. Were the plans that the latter had made, the plans that had given happiness to the last year of the life of him who had known so little happiness, to be shattered? This, to her mind, was even more than the loss that Ralph would suffer. "They may have destroyed the will," she said at last, "but if not, I will find it, if it takes me all my life to do so." A week later 2 letters arrived. The one was from Mrs. Withers. The will had not been found. Mr. Tallboys had searched in vain. Every cabinet and drawer in the house had been ransacked. No signs whatever had been found of the will. "Mr. Tallboys is perfectly convinced that it must be hidden in some altogether exceptional place. The will was not a bulky document, and might have been stowed away in a comparatively small hiding place, such as a secret drawer in a cabinet, but the leases that are also missing are bulky, and would take up so large a space that he is convinced that had a secret hiding place sufficiently large to hold them existed in any of the articles of furniture he has searched, he should have discovered it. Of course, my dear Mrs. Conway, we feel this matter personally, as our Mabel was, as you know, made joint heiress with your Ralph of Herbert's property. We cannot but feel, however, that the loss is greater in your case than ours. Mabel was never informed of Herbert's intentions towards her, and although we should of course have been glad to know that our child had such brilliant prospects, the loss of them will not, we may hope, in any way affect her happiness. In the case of your son it is different, and his prospects in life will of course be seriously affected by the loss, and my husband begs me to express to you his very deep regret at this. We have talked over your letter together, and while fully sharing your indignation at the conduct of the Misses Penfold, hardly see that anything can be done to discover the will. However, should you be able to point out any manner in which a search for it could be carried on, we shall be happy to do what we can to aid in the matter, as it is clearly our duty to endeavour to obtain for Mabel the fortune Herbert Penfold willed to her. Mr. Tallboys tells us that it is clear the Misses Penfold have quite determined upon their line of conduct. Whatever they may know, they have declined altogether to aid him in his search for the will, Miss Penfold saying, in reply to his request that they would do so, that they have every reason to believe, from what their brother had let fall, that the will was an unjust and iniquitous one, and that if Providence intended it should see the light it would see it, but they at least would do nothing in the matter. He asked them plainly if they were aware of the existence of any place in which it was likely that their brother had placed it. To this Miss Penfold, who is, as she has always been, the spokesman of the 2 persons, said shortly that she had never seen the will, that she didn't want to see it, and that she did not know whither her brother had placed it. Indeed, for aught she knew, he might have torn it up. As to hiding places, she knew of no hiding place whose existence she could, in accordance with the dictates of her conscience, divulge. So that is where we are at present, Mrs. Conway. I believe that Mr. Tallboys is going to try and get a copy of the will that he has in his possession admitted, under the circumstances, as proof of Herbert Penfold's intentions, but he owned to us that he thought it was very doubtful whether he should be able to do so, especially as Herbert had stated to him that he intended to make alterations, and it would be quite possible that a court might take the view that, in the first place, the alterations might have been so extensive as to affect the whole purport of the will, and in the second place that he might have come to the conclusion that it would be easier to make the whole will afresh, and so had destroyed the one he had by him. Mrs. Conway laid down the letter, and after thinking for a time, opened the other, which was in a handwriting unknown to her. It began: Dear Madam, Mrs. Withers tells me that she has informed you of the singular disappearance of the will of my late client, Mr. Herbert Penfold. I beg to inform you that we shall not let this matter rest, but shall apply to the court to allow the copy of the will to be put forth in probate. If that is refused, for authorization to make a closer search of the hall than we have hitherto been able to do, supporting our demand with affidavits made by the Reverend Mr. Withers and ourselves, of our knowledge that the late Mr. Penfold was accustomed to keeping documents in some secret receptacle. In the second place, we are glad to inform you that the annual sum paid by us into the Kentish Bank to your credit will not be affected by the loss of the will, for at the time when that payment was first commenced, Mr. Penfold signed a deed making this payment a first charge on the rents of 2 of his farms during your lifetime. This assignment was of a binding character, and of course continues to hold good. We shall consider it our duty to acquaint you from time to time with the course of proceedings in the matter of the late Mr. Penfold's will." Little as Mrs. Conway had thought of herself from the time when she first heard that the will was missing, the news that her income would remain unchanged delighted her. She had formed no plans for herself, but had vaguely contemplated the necessity of giving up her house as soon as it was decided that the will could not be found, selling her furniture, and for the present taking a small lodging. She was glad that there would be no occasion for this, but very much more glad that she should be able now to make Ralph an allowance of £70 or £80 a year, which would make all the difference between his living comfortably and being obliged to pinch himself in every way to subsist upon his pay. It would of course also enable her to carry out without difficulty any plans that she might determine upon. Upon the receipt of the letter announcing Mr. Penfold's death, she had written to Ralph telling him of it, but saying nothing about Mr. Talboys' visit to the Withers, or his report that he was unable to find the will. She now wrote to him relating the whole circumstances. He had not previously known Mr. Penfold's intention to make him his heir, being only told that he intended to push his way in life, and had considered that the promise was carried out by his obtaining him a commission and arranging some allowance. His mother was glad of this now. "Of course the loss of Mr. Penfold's will, my boy, will make a difference to you, as there can be no doubt that he had made some provisions in it for the regular payment of the allowance he had so kindly promised you. This, unless the will is found, you will of course lose. Having been a soldier's daughter, I know that to live comfortably in the army it is necessary to have something beyond your pay, but fortunately I can assist you a little. I have now one less to feed and clothe, and no schooling expenses, and I have been calculating things up, and find that I can allow you £75 a year without making any difference in the manner of my living. You will be able to see that for yourself. You need therefore feel no hesitation in accepting this allowance. It's not a large one, but I know it will make a very great difference in your comfort, and it will be a great pleasure to me to know that you will be able to enter into what amusements are going on, and not to look at every penny. It makes all the difference in the world whether one has 4 and 6pence or 9 shillings a day to live on. You wrote and told me of the handsome present Mr. Penfold made you at parting. This, my boy, I should keep, if I were you, as a reserve, only to be touched in case of unexpected difficulties or needs. No one can ever say when such needs may occur. I hope you will not pain me by writing to say you don't want this allowance, because nothing you can say will alter my determination to pay that allowance regularly every quarter into your agent's hands. And it will be, of course, very much more pleasant to me to know that it is as much a pleasure to you to be helped by me as it is to me to help you. I've heard several times from Mrs. Withers. They are all well, and she asked me to send their remembrances to you when I write. I do not give up all hope that the will may be found one of these days, but it's just as well that we should not build in the slightest upon it." Ralph's reply came in due time, that is, in about a fortnight afterward, for Mrs. Conway's letter had first to go by coach to London, then 2 days' journey by the mail to Liverpool, then by the sailing packet across to Dublin, and then down to Cork by coach. He had already written expressing his regret at the news of Mr. Penfold's death. "My dear mother," he began, "it is awfully good of you to talk about making an allowance to me. After what you say, of course I cannot think of refusing it, though I would do so if I thought the payment would in the slightest way inconvenience you. But as you say that now I am away it will make something like that some difference in your expenses, I must of course let you do as you like, and can only thank you very heartily for it. But I could really have gotten on very well without it. I really fancy that a good many men in the regiment have nothing but their pay, and as they manage very well there is no reason I could not manage too. Of course in war times things are not kept up so expensively as they were before, and lots of men get commissions who would not have done so when the army was only half its present size, and was considered as a gentlemanly profession instead of a real fighting machine. However, as you say, it's a great deal more pleasant having 9 shillings a day to live on instead of 4 and 6pence. I'm getting on capitally here. Of course there's a lot of drill, and it's as much as I can do not to laugh sometimes. The sergeant, who is a fierce little man, gets into such wild rages over our blunders. I say our blunders, for of course Stapleton and I are drilled with the recruits. However, I think that in another week I shall be over that, and shall then begin to learn my work as an officer. There are a jolly set of fellows here, always up to some fun or other. I always thought when fellows got to be men that they were rather serious, but it seems to me that there's ever so much more fun here among them than there was at school. Of course newcomers get worried a little, just as they do at school. I got off very well because, you see, what with school and the privateer, I have learned to take things good-temperedly, and when fellows see that you are as ready for fun as they are, they soon give up bothering you. Stapleton has had a lot more trouble because, you see, he will look at things seriously. I think he's getting a little better now, but he used to get quite mad at first, and of course that made the fellows ever so much worse. He would find his doors screwed up when he went back after mess, and as soon as they found that he was awfully particular about his boots, they filled them all full of water one night. Oh, and then someone got a ladder and threw a lot of crackers into his bedroom in the middle of the night, and Stapleton came rushing down in his nightshirt with his sword drawn, swearing he would kill somebody. Of course, I have done all I can to get them to leave him alone, for he is really a good fellow, and explained to them that he had never been to school or had a chance of learning to keep his temper, but he's getting on now, and will, I think, soon be left alone. This has been an awfully long letter, and there's only just enough candle left for me to get into bed by. Anyway, Mother, I'm not a bit upset about losing Mr. Penfold's allowance, so don't you worry yourself at all about that. Some weeks passed on. Mr. Tallboys wrote that he had failed to induce the court to accept a copy of the will, the admission he was forced to make that Mr. Penfold had intended to make an alteration in it being fatal. He had, however, obtained an order authorizing him thoroughly to search the house, and to take down any wainscoting and to pull up any floors that might appear likely to conceal a hiding-place. A fortnight later he wrote again to announce his failure. The Miss Penfolds, he said, were so indignant that they left the house altogether, and you may believe that we ransacked it from top to bottom. I had 4 carpenters and 2 masons with me, and I think we tapped every square foot of wall in the house, took down the wainscoting where there was the slightest hollow sound, lifted lots of flooring, and even wrenched up several of the hearthstones, but could find nothing whatever, except that there was a staircase leading from behind the wainscoting in Mr. Penfold's room to a door covered with ivy, and concealed from view by bushes to the left of the house. But the ivy had evidently been undisturbed for 50 years or so. This passage, even if known to Mr. Penfold, had certainly not been used in this time. I truly regret, my dear madam, that the search should have been so unsuccessful, and can only say that all that could be done has been done. That the will is concealed somewhere I have not a shadow of a doubt, unless, of course, it has been torn up before this. As to that, I give no opinion. And, indeed, as it's a matter in which women are concerned, your judgment as to the probabilities is much more likely to be correct than mine. As I expected, my business connection with the family has come to an end. The Miss Penfolds have appointed another agent, who has written to me requesting me to hand over all papers connected with the property. This, of course, I shall do. I need hardly say that in no case could I have consented to act for those whom I consider to be unlawful possessors of the property. In conclusion, I can only say that my services will at all times be at your disposal. Mrs. Conway was scarcely disappointed at the receipt of this letter, for she had quite made up her mind that the will would not be found. These women had clearly made up their minds to deprive Ralph and Mabel of their rights, and unless they had felt perfectly satisfied that no search would discover the hiding-place of the will, they would not improbably have taken it, and either destroyed it or concealed it in some fresh place where the searchers would never be likely to look for it. She did not think it likely, therefore, that the hiding-place would be discovered, and she felt assured that, were it discovered, it would be found empty. "Very well," she said in a quiet, determined voice, as she laid down the letter. "Mr. Tallboys has failed. Now I shall take up the matter. I dare say you think that you have won, Miss Penfold, that you are now mistress beyond dispute of Herbert's property. You will see the battle has only just begun. It will last, I can tell you, all your lives or mine." A week later an altogether unexpected event took place. When Mr. and Mrs. Withers were at breakfast, a letter arrived from Mr. Littleton, now solicitor to the Miss Penfolds. Upon opening it, it was found to contain an offer upon the part of the Miss Penfolds to settle the sum of 100 a year for life upon Mabel, upon the condition only that the allowance would be stopped upon her marriage, unless that marriage received the approval in writing of the Miss Penfolds. The letter was addressed to Mr. Withers, and after reading it through he passed it to his wife without a word. She was too surprised to say anything for a moment, especially as Mabel was in the room, and she laid the letter beside her until breakfast was over and Mabel had gone out. "Well, James, what do you think of it?" she asked. "What do you think of it yourself?" he replied. Mrs. Withers hesitated, and then said, "Well, James, it's the sort of a thing that requires so much thinking about that I have scarcely had time to turn it over in my mind yet, especially with Mabel here eating at breakfast opposite, and having no idea that this letter contained anything of such importance to her. I would really rather hear what you think about it." Mr. Withers remained silent, and she went on, "Of course it would be a very nice thing for Mabel to have such a provision for life." A slight smile passed across Mr. Withers' face, and his wife saw that that was not at all the way in which he looked at it. "It is just like you men, James," she said a little pettishly. "You ask us what we think about things, when you have perfectly made up your minds what you mean to do, whether we agree with you or not." "Oh, I don't think that's often the case with us. Still, I did want to see whether the matter would have struck you at once in the same light in which I see it, and I perceive that it has not." "Well, James, let me hear your view of the matter. I dare say I shall agree with you when you tell me what it is." "Well then, Amy," Mr. Withers said seriously, "it appears to me that we cannot accept this offer for Mabel." Mrs. Withers looked a little blank. The living was not a rich one, and assured as they had been by Mr. Penfold that he intended to provide for Mabel, they had not endeavoured to lay by anything for her, and had freely dispensed their surplus income among the sick and needy of the parish. The disappearance of the will had disappointed their hopes, and raised many anxious thoughts in Mrs. Withers' mind respecting Mabel's future, and the offer contained in the letter had therefore filled her with pleasure. But she greatly valued her husband's judgment, and therefore only replied, "Why, dear?" "Well, you see, wife, we are both thoroughly agreed that these ladies are depriving Mabel of the fortune Herbert Penfold left her. They are concealing or have destroyed this will, and are at present in what we may call fraudulent possession of his property. Now, I do not think that under these circumstances we can accept a favour at their hands. To do so would be practically to acquiesce in what we consider the robbery of our child, and the acceptance would of course involve a renewal of friendly relations with them, a thing which, believing as we do that they are acting wickedly, would be distasteful in the extreme, not to say impossible." "Of course you are right, dear," Mrs. Withers said, rising from her seat and going over and kissing her husband tenderly. "I had not thought of it in that light at all. In fact, I had hardly thought about it at all, except that it would be nice to see Mabel provided for." "Yes, it would be nice, my dear, but we surely need not be anxious about her. We may hope that she will make a happy marriage. We may hope, too, that we may be spared long enough to make some provision for her, for, of course, we must now curtail our expenses, and lay by as much as we can for her. Lastly, dear, we need not be anxious, because we trust that God will provide for her should we not be enabled to do so. But even were I sure that we should both be taken together, I would rather leave her in his hands than accept money wrongfully obtained, and condone an abominable action. There is, too, another point from which the matter should be looked at. You see this curious condition that they propose, that the annuity shall be forfeited unless she marry with their sanction. Now, why should they propose such a condition?" "Well, I'm sure I don't know, James, for of course we should never give our sanction to her marriage unless we approved of her choice, and surely the Miss Penfolds would not disapprove of a choice that we approved of." "Well, they might, my dear. You know how bitterly they disliked Ralph Conway, and how they resented his being at the Hall. It's quite possible that they may have had some idea of Herbert's views about him and Mabel, and are determined that we shall not benefit through Mabel by one penny of their brother's property, and this clause is specially designed so that in case the two young people ever should come together, they may be able, if not to stop it, at any rate to stop the annuity. That's the only interpretation I can give to this condition." "Yes, very likely that is so, James. Really, these women seem to get more detestable every day." Mr. Withers smiled at his wife's vehemence. "There's still another reason why we cannot take the money. Ralph Conway has been as much defrauded as Mabel, and his mother, as you see by her letters, is determined not to sit down quietly under the wrong. What she means to do I have not the slightest idea, nor do I think that there is the most remote probability she'll ever be successful in finding the will. Tallboys appears to have made a most thorough search of the house, and do what she will, she cannot have an opportunity of searching as he has done. Still, she clearly has something on her mind. She intends to make some attempt or other to discover the will, which, if found, will benefit Mabel equally with her son. Therefore we cannot but regard her as our friend and ally. Now, were we to accept the money from Mabel, we should in fact be acquiescing, not only in the wrong done to her, but in that done to Ralph. We should in fact be going over to the enemy. We could not take their money and even tacitly connive in her efforts to find the will. "Oh, I agree with you entirely, James. It would be impossible. Only I do wish you had said all this before letting me be so foolish as to say that I thought we ought to take it." "Oh, you didn't say so, dear," Mr. Withers said, smiling. "You only gave expression to the first natural thought of a mother that it would be a nice thing for Mabel. You had given the matter no further consideration than that, and I was quite sure that, as soon as you thought the matter over, you'd see it in the same light that I do. I think that before we send off our reply we should put the matter before Mabel herself. I have no doubt whatever what her answer will be, but at the same time she ought to know of the offer which has been made to her." Chapter 9. Mr. Tallboys' Visitor. Mr. Withers was fully justified in his conviction that there need be no doubt as to the view Mabel would take of the Miss Penfolds' offer. The girl had hitherto been in entire ignorance both as to the will being missing and of the interest she had in it. She was now called in from the garden, and was much surprised when her father told her to sit down, as he and her mother wished to have a serious talk with her. "Do you know, my little Mabel," he began, "that you have had a narrow escape of being an heiress?" "An heiress, papa? Do you mean of having a lot of money?" "Yes, of coming in some day to a fortune. Mr. Penfold some time ago confided to your mother and me his intention of dividing his property equally between Ralph Conway and yourself." "What, all the Penfold estates, papa, and the house and everything?" "Yes, my dear, everything, including the large sum of money that has accumulated during the years Mr. Penfold has not been spending a third of his income." "Then if he meant that, papa, how is it that I am not going to be an heiress?" "Simply, my dear, because the will by which Mr. Penfold left the property to you and Ralph is missing." Mr. Withers then told the whole story of the loss of the will, the search that had been made for it, and the strong grounds there were for believing in the existence of some secret place in the hall, and that this place of concealment was known to Mr. Penfold's sisters. "But they surely could never be so wicked as that, papa. They have always seemed to like me, well, not very much, you know, because they thought I wasn't quiet and ladylike enough, but still I don't think they really disliked me. No, I think in their way they liked you, Mabel, and perhaps if Mr. Penfold had half left his property to you, divided the other half between them, the will would have been found. But they certainly did not like Ralph Conway. They disliked him partly, no doubt, for himself, but principally on account of a wrong which I believe they once did to his mother. Now, if it is in human nature, Mabel, that you may forgive a wrong done to you, but it is very hard to forgive a person you have wronged. Anyhow, I am convinced that it was more to prevent Mrs. Conway's son from getting this money than to get it themselves that they have concealed this will, or rather that they refuse to point out its place of concealment." "But it does seem hard, papa, that Mr. Penfold should have left everything to Ralph and me, and nothing to his sisters." "Oh, the Miss Penfolds have a very comfortable income of their own, Mabel, and their brother might very well have thought there was no occasion for them to have more. Besides, although they lived in his house, and indeed managed it and him, Mr. Penfold had, I know, strong reason to believe that they had ruined his life. But this is a matter into which we need not go. Well, Mabel, the Miss Penfolds have just given a proof that they do not dislike you. Now I will read you this letter, because I think you ought to know it has been written, and I will then tell you the reasons why your mother and I think that the offer cannot be accepted." Mabel listened in silence until her father had finished the arguments that he had used with his wife, with the exception only of that relating to the Miss Penfolds' motives in putting in the condition concerning Mabel's marriage. When he ceased speaking, she exclaimed indignantly, "Of course, papa, we could not take the money, not if it were 10 times as much. Why, we could not look Mrs. Conway and Ralph in the face again. Besides, how could we speak to people one believes to have done such a wicked thing?" "Very well, Mabel, I was quite sure that you would agree with us, but at the very same time I thought it was right, before we refused the offer, you should know that it was made. Whatever our sentiments on the subject might be, we should not have been justified in refusing without your knowledge an offer that might, from a worldly point of view, be to your interest to accept." "Why, papa," Mabel said, "I would rather go out and weed turnips or watch sheep, like some of the girls in the village, than touch a penny of the Miss Penfolds' money." A short time after this Mr. Tallboys' clerk brought a letter into his private office. "A lady asked me to give you this, sir." The solicitor opened it. It contained only a card. "Show the lady in. How are you, madam? I am glad to have the pleasure of making your acquaintance. I suppose you are staying with Mr. Withers?" "No, Mr. Tallboy, I am at the hotel here. I only arrived an hour since by the packet from Dover." "Dear me, I am afraid you have had a very unpleasant voyage." "It has not been pleasant," Mrs. Conway said quietly, "but I prefer it to the long journey by coach up to London and down here again. We were 5 days on the way, as the vessel put in at many ports. Still, that was quite a minor question with me. I wanted to see you and have a talk with you personally. There's no saying into whose hands letters may fall, and one talk face to face does more good than a score of letters." Mr. Tallboys looked rather surprised, and the idea flashed across his mind that the only business Mrs. Conway could want to see him about must be some proposal for raising money upon the security of her annuity. "I presume, Mr. Tallboys, from what I hear, that you are as thoroughly convinced as I am myself that this will of Mr. Penfold's is in existence and is hidden somewhere about the Hall?" "Oh yes, I think so, Mrs. Conway. That is, supposing it has not been destroyed." "Do you think it likely that it has been destroyed, Mr. Tallboys?" "Well, that I cannot say," the solicitor said gravely. "I have, of course, thought much over this matter. It's one that naturally vexed me much for several reasons. In the first place, Mr. Withers and you yourself have been good enough to place the matter in my hands, and to authorize me to act for you, and it is always a sort of vexation to a professional man when his clients lose their cause, especially when he is convinced that they are in the right. In the second place, I am much disturbed that the wishes of my late client, Mr. Penfold, should not have been carried out. Thirdly, I feel now that I myself am somewhat to blame in the matter, in that I did not represent to Mr. Penfold the imprudence of his placing valuable papers in a place where, should anything happen to him suddenly, they might not be found. Of course, I could not have anticipated this hostile action on the part of the Miss Penfolds. Still, I blame myself that I did not warn Mr. Penfold of the possibility of what has in fact happened and has taken place. Lastly," and he smiled, "I have a personal feeling in the matter. I have lost a business that added somewhat considerably to my income." "Oh, I don't think any of us have thought of blaming you in the matter, Mr. Tallboys. I am sure that I have not. You could not possibly have foreseen that Mr. Penfold's sisters were likely to turn out thieves." "Well, that is rather a strong expression, Mrs. Conway, though natural enough, I must admit, in your position as Mr. Ralph Conway's mother. You see, there is a difference between concealing and not disclosing. Mr. Penfold himself concealed the will. The Miss Penfolds simply refused to assist us in our search for it. And as the nearest heirs, they take possession of the property." "Quite so, Mrs. Conway. I am not defending their conduct, which morally is dishonest in the extreme, but I doubt whether any court of law would find it to be a punishable offence." "Well now, Mr. Tallboys, I want you to let me know whether you suspect that they have destroyed the will, which I suppose would be a punishable offence." "Oh, certainly. The destruction of the will, in order that those who destroyed it might get possession of property, would be criminal." "Well, I don't know. I have thought it over in every sense, and I think the balance of probability is against their having destroyed it. In the first place, the Miss Penfolds doubtless consider that the will is so securely hidden there is little if any chance of its being discovered. That this is so, as we know, from the fact that although I ransacked the house from top to bottom, pulled down wainscoting, lifted floors, and tried every imaginable point which either I or the men who were working with me suspected to be a likely spot for a hiding place, we did not succeed in finding it. Now, I have noticed that ladies have at times somewhat peculiar ideas as to morality, and are apt to steer very close to the wind. The Miss Penfolds may consider themselves perfectly justified in declining to give us any assistance in finding the will, soothing their consciences by the reflection that by such refusal they are committing no offence of which the law takes cognizance, but while doing this they might shrink from the absolutely criminal offence of destroying the will. I do not say that now they have entered upon the path they have that they would not destroy the will if they thought there was a chance of its being discovered. I only say that, thinking it to be absolutely safe, they are unlikely to perform an act which, if discovered, would bring them under the power of the law. They may consider themselves free to believe, if not actually to believe, to try and convince themselves that for aught they know their brother may have destroyed the will, and that it is not for them to prove whether he did so or not. Upon these grounds, therefore, it seems to me probable that the will is still in existence, but I acknowledge that so far as its utility is concerned, it might as well have been destroyed by Mr. Penfold himself or by his sisters. Well, Mr. Tallboys, no doubt you are thinking that you might as well have expressed this opinion to me on paper, and that I have troubled myself very unnecessarily in making this journey to have it from you from your own lips. Well, yes, Mrs. Conway, I do not deny that this has been in my mind. It would have been useless for me to make the journey had this been all, Mr. Tallboys. I am very glad to have heard your opinion, which agrees exactly with that which I myself have formed, but it was scarcely with the object of eliciting that I have made this journey. We will now proceed to that part of the subject. We agree that the will is probably still in existence, and that it is hidden somewhere about the hall. The next question is, how is it to be found? Ah, that is a very difficult question indeed, Mrs. Conway. Yes, it is difficult, but not, I think, impossible. You have done your best, Mr. Tallboys, and have failed. You have no further suggestion to offer, no plan that occurs to you by which you might discover it? None whatever, Mr. Tallboys said decidedly. I have done all that I could do, and have, in fact, dismissed the question altogether from my mind. I had the authority of the court to search, and I have searched very fully, and have reported my failure to the court. The power to search would certainly not be renewed unless upon some very strong grounds indeed. I suppose not, Mr. Tallboys. That is what I expected. Well, it seems to me that you have done all in your power for us, your clients, and having now relinquished your search, it's time for us, or some of us, to take the matter in hand. Mr. Tallboys looked surprised. I do not quite understand, Mrs. Conway, how you can take it in hand. No, well, I can tell you, Mr. Tallboys, that I am going to do so. I am not going to sit down quietly and see my son robbed of his inheritance. I have quite made up my mind to devote my life to this matter, and I have come not to ask your advice, for I dare say you would try to dissuade me, and my resolution is unalterable, but to ask you to give me what aid you can in the matter. Oh, I shall be glad to give you aid in any way, Mrs. Conway, if you will point out to me the direction in which my assistance can be of use. I suppose you formed some sort of plan, for I own that I can see no direction whatever in which you can set about the matter. My intention is, Mr. Tallboys, to search for this hiding place myself. Mr. Tallboys raised his eyebrows in surprise. To search yourself, Mrs. Conway, but how do you propose to gain admittance to the hall? And how, even supposing that you gain admittance, do you propose to do more than we have done, or even so much, because any fresh disturbance of the fabric of the house would be out of the question? Yes, that I quite admit. Still, we know there is the hiding place, and it is morally certain that that hiding place is opened or approached by the touching of some secret spring. It's not by pulling down wainscoting, or by pulling up floors, or by force used in any way. That is to be found. Mr. Penfold, it would seem, used it habitually as a depository for papers of value. He certainly, therefore, had not to break down or pull up anything. He opened it as he would open any other cabinet or cupboard, by means of a key or by touching a spring. You agree with me so far, Mr. Tallboys? Why, certainly, Mrs. Conway. There can be no doubt in my mind that this hiding place, whether a chamber or a small closet, is open in the way you speak of. Very well, then. All that has to be looked for is a spring. No force is requisite. All that is to be done is to find the spring. Well, yes, but how is it to be done? I believe we tried every square foot of the building. Oh, I have no doubt you did, but it will be necessary to try every square inch, I will not say of the whole building, but of certain rooms and passages. I think we may assume that it is not in the upper rooms or servants' quarters. Such a hiding place would be contrived where it could be used by the owners of the house without observation from their dependents, and would therefore be either in the drawing-room, dining-room, the principal bedchambers, or the passages, corridors, or stairs between or adjoining these. Oh, I quite follow you in your reasoning, Mrs. Conway, and agree with you. Doubtless the place is so situated as to be what I may call handy to the owners of the Hall, but I still do not see how you are going to set about finding it." "I am going to set about it by going to live at the Hall." "Going to live at the Hall, Mrs. Conway? But how is that possible under the circumstances? You are, I should say, the last person whom the Miss Penfolds would at present invite to take up a residence there." "Oh, I agree with you fully. But if they had any idea of my identity But that is just what I intend they shall not have. My plan is to go there in the capacity of a servant. Once there I shall examine, as I say, every square inch of the rooms and places where this hiding place is likely to exist. Every knob, knot, or inequality of any kind in the woodwork and stonework shall be pressed, pulled, and twisted until I find it. I am aware that the task may occupy months or even years, for of course my opportunities will be limited. Still, whether months or years, I intend to undertake it and to carry it through, if my life is spared, until I have had time thoroughly and completely to carry it out." Mr. Tallboys was silent from sheer astonishment. "Do you really mean that you are thinking of going there as a servant, Mrs. Conway?" "Certainly I do," she replied calmly. "I suppose the work will be no harder for me than for other women, and whereas they do it for some £10 or £12 a year, I shall do it for a fortune. I see not the slightest difficulty or objection in that part of the business. I shall, of course, let my house at Dover, making arrangements for my son's letters there being forwarded, and for my letters to him being posted in Dover. I shall have the satisfaction that while engaged upon this work my income will be accumulating for his benefit. I own that I can see no difficulty whatever in my plan being carried out. Now, as to the assistance that I wish you to give me, it could perhaps have been more readily given by Mr. Withers, for naturally he would know personally most of the servants of the Hall, as the majority of them doubtless belong to the village. But Mr. Withers, as a clergyman, might have conscientious scruples against taking any part in a scheme which, however righteous its ends, must be conducted by what he would consider underground methods, and involving a certain amount of deceit. At any rate, I think it better that neither he nor Mrs. Withers should have any complicity whatever in my plans. I therefore come to you. What I want, in the first place, is to find out when a vacancy is likely to be caused by some servant leaving. Secondly, if no such vacancy is likely to occur, for a vacancy to be manufactured by inducing some servant to leave. A present of a year's wages would probably accomplish that. Thirdly, the vacancy must occur in the case of some servant whose work would naturally lie in the part of the building I have to examine. Finally, it must be arranged that I can be so recommended as to ensure my getting the place." Mr. Tallboys was silent for some time. "Certainly your plan does appear feasible, Mrs. Conway," he said at length. "It does seem to me that, if once installed in the way you propose at the Hall, and prepared to spend, as you say, months or even years in the search, it is possible and even probable that in the end you may light upon the spring that will open this mystery. You must be prepared to face much unpleasantness. You will have for all this time to associate with servants, to do menial work, to relinquish all the luxuries and appliances to which you have all your life been accustomed, and possibly to fail at last. Still, if you are prepared to face all this, there does appear to me to be a possibility of your enterprise being crowned with success. I have thought it all over, Mr. Tallboys, and am quite prepared to submit to all the sacrifices you mention, which, however, will scarcely be felt by me to be sacrifices, working as I shall be for the future of my son. And now, can I rely upon your assistance?" "You shall have any assistance I can give, assuredly, Mrs. Conway. The matter is by no means a simple one, still I can see no reason why it should not be successfully carried out." "It must take time, that I quite anticipate, Mr. Tallboys. Time, fortunately, is of no consequence." "Well, Mrs. Conway," Mr. Tallboys said, after sitting for some minutes in thought, "it's a matter that will require careful thinking over. How long do you intend staying here?" "Just as long as it is necessary," Mrs. Conway said. "A day or a month. I have not given my own name at the George, but shall be known there as Mrs. Brown. As you saw, I sent my card in an envelope, so that even your clerk should not be aware that Mrs. Conway was in Weymouth." "But," the solicitor said suddenly, "surely the Miss Penfolds knew you in the old time?" "Well, certainly they did, but, to begin with, that is nearly 20 years ago, and of course I have changed very much since then." "Oh, not very much, Mrs. Conway," the lawyer said, "for I once had the pleasure of seeing you when I went to the Hall to see Mr. Penfold on business. I do not say that I should have known you anywhere, but having had your card I remembered you at once when you came into the room, and indeed, if you will excuse my saying so, you might pass anywhere as 30. "Well, so much the better for my purpose at present," Mrs. Conway replied. 30 will do very well for the age of a housemaid at the Hall. I should imagine the Miss Penfolds would prefer a woman of that age to a young girl. Besides, you see, I must be an upper housemaid in order to have charge of the part of the house I want to examine. As to knowing me, in the first place, the Miss Penfolds will not have the advantage of receiving my card, and in the second place, it is not very difficult for a woman to alter her appearance so as to be unrecognizable by another who has not seen her for 20 years. My hair is a good deal darker now than it was then, and I wore it altogether differently. A little black dye on that, and my eyebrows, a servant's cap and gown, will so alter me that you who see me now would hardly know me. Certainly they will not do so. You need not trouble about that, Mr. Tallboys. I will answer for it that they shall not know me. It's possible, just possible, that Mr. and Mrs. Withers might know me if they saw me in church, but I shall, without letting them know my plans, guard against any indiscretion. Now, as we have quite settled the matter, Mr. Tallboys, I shall go back to the inn, and when you have thought the matter over and decided upon the best plan for carrying out my wishes, you will send a note to Mrs. Brown at the George, making an appointment for me to meet you here." Mr. Tallboys sat for some time in thought after Mrs. Conway had left him. It was certainly a daring scheme, requiring no little courage, resolution, and self-possession to carry out, but his client evidently possessed all these qualities. She had a clear head, and seemed to have grasped every point in the matter. There was really no reason why she should not succeed. There must be a spring somewhere, and if she was as patient as she declared herself to be, she would surely find it sooner or later. That is, if she could carry out her search without exciting suspicion. The first difficulty was to get her settled at the Hall. Now, what was the best way to set about that? It certainly not was as easy as she seemed to think. Still, there must be some way of managing it. At any rate, he must act cautiously in the matter, and must not appear in it in any way personally. And so he sat thinking until at last the clerk, who had been a good deal surprised at receiving no instruction from him as to several matters he had in hand, knocked at the door and came in with a number of papers, and Mr. Tallboys was obliged to dismiss the matter from his mind for a time, and to attend to present business. The very next morning Mrs. Conway received the note, and again went to the office. "Do you know, Mrs. Conway," he began, as soon as his client entered, "the more I think over the matter, the more I feel that it is extremely difficult to manage it from here. I should have to engage someone to go over in the first place. He would have to stay in the village some time before he could make the acquaintance of the servants at the Hall. He would have to get very intimate with them before he could venture to broach such a thing, for if he made a mistake, and the woman told her mistress that someone had been trying to persuade her to leave in order to introduce another into the place, their suspicions would be so aroused that the scheme would become hopeless." "Yes, I see that difficulty, Mr. Tallboys, for I thought it over in every way before I came to you. Besides, I don't like the thought of this intermediate. No doubt you would choose a trustworthy man. Still, I don't like the thought of anyone knowing the secret, especially as the plan may take so long working out. What I have been thinking, Mrs. Conway, is this. No doubt the servants at the Hall have taken sides on this matter. Of course, from our searches they know that Mr. Penfold's will is missing, and that it is because it is missing that the Miss Penfolds are now mistresses there. Without knowing anything myself about the feeling of the servants there, beyond what probably would be the case from the difference of character between Mr. Penfold and his sisters, I should imagine that they were fond of him, for he was the kindest and most easygoing of masters, and not very fond of his sisters, who are, as I have always observed in the course of my professional visits there, the reverse of agreeable. If this is the case, not improbably there may be one or other of these women with whom you might open direct negotiations. What has struck me is this. The men who were over there with me of course slept and took their meals in the village. Still, going about as they did in the house, no doubt they talked with the servants. The Miss Penfolds were away, and I dare say the women had plenty of time to gossip, and it's probable the men gathered from their talk something of their sentiments toward the Miss Penfolds and their brother, and which side they would like to go with. I might ask the foreman about it." "I think that idea is capital, Mr. Tallboys. But there is one detail I think might be improved upon. I imagine that if, instead of asking the foreman, you choose the youngest and best looking of the men, provided he is unmarried, you are more likely to get at the women's sentiments." Mr. Tallboys laughed. "No doubt you are right, Mrs. Conway. That shall be done. I must get the foreman first, though, for I don't know the names or addresses of the other men. I shall tell him frankly that I want to find out the opinions of the servants at the Hall about the missing will. Ask him which of his men was the most given to gossip with them, and tell him to send that man here to me at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Then, when you see him and hear what he has to say, you can judge for yourself how far you care to trust him in the matter, or whether to trust him at all. Perhaps you will come here a few minutes before 10, and then I can tell you what the foreman has said first." Accordingly, at 9:45 the next day, Mrs. Conway was again at the office. "I think, Mrs. Conway, that things are going even better than we hoped. The foreman said that from what little talk he had with the servants, he thought they had all been attached to Mr. Penfold, and that his sisters were by no means popular among them. He said very often one or other of them would come into the room where they were working and make suggestions, and hunt about themselves to see if they could find anything. But the best part of it is that one of the carpenters, a steady fellow of some 25 years, took up, as he calls it, with the upper housemaid, and he believes that there is talk, at least, about their being married some day. If this is so, it would be the very thing for you. You could help him get married, and the girl could help you to get her place." "Why, the very thing," Mrs. Conway said. "Nothing could have turned out better." In a few minutes the young carpenter arrived. He was a pleasant-looking young fellow, and Mrs. Conway was not surprised at the impression he had made upon the housemaid at the Hall. "Sit down, Johnson," Mr. Tallboys began. "You know what I asked you to come here for?" "Mr. Peters told me it would be something to do with that job we had at the Miss Penfold's, sir." "Yes, that is it, Johnson. You know we were looking for a missing will there." "Yes, sir, so I understood." "Now, what we wanted to ask you specifically, Johnson, was whether you can tell us what the servants at the Hall thought about it." The young carpenter turned rather red in the face and twisted his cap about in his fingers. "Well, sir, I don't know that I can say much about that. I don't think most of them was over fond of the Miss Penfolds, and wouldn't have been sorry if that will had been found that would have given them another master or mistress." "Just so, Johnson. That is what I thought was likely. Now, the point I want to know, Johnson, and this lady here is, I may tell you, interested in the matter of this will being found as well, is as to whether there is, in your opinion, any one of the maids at the Hall who could be trusted to aid us in this business. Of course, we should make it worth her while to do so." Again the young carpenter coloured and fidgeted on his chair, examining his cap intently. "Well, I suppose it would depend on what you wanted her to do," he said at last. "The Hall's a good service, though they don't like the mistresses, and of course none of them would like to do anything that might risk their place." "Oh, that's certainly natural enough, Johnson. But you see, we could perhaps more than make up to her for that risk." Well, I don't know, sir," the man said after another pause. It isn't only the place, but you see, a young woman wouldn't like to risk getting into a row like and being turned away in disgrace, or perhaps even worse. I don't know what you want, you see, sir." Mr. Tallboys looked at Mrs. Conway, and his eyes expressed the question, "How far shall we go?" She replied by taking the matter in her own hands. "We can trust you, can't we, whether you agree to help us or not?" "Oh, yes, ma'am," he said more decidedly than he had hitherto spoken. "You can trust me. If you tell me what you want, I'll tell you straight whether I can do anything. If I don't like it, the matter shan't go beyond me." "Very well, then, I will tell you exactly what we want. We believe that the will is still there, and we believe that if someone in the house were to make a thorough search, it might be found. It's right that it should be found, and that the property should go to those to whom Mr. Penfold left it, and who are now being kept out of it by the Miss Penfolds. I am very much interested in the matter, because it is my son who is being cheated out of his rights, and I have made up my mind to find the will. Now, what I want to know is, do you think that one of the housemaids would be willing to give up her place and introduce me as her successor, if I gave her £25? That would be a nice little sum, you know, to begin housekeeping with." Mrs. Conway saw at once by the expression of the young carpenter's face that she had secured him as an ally. "Oh, I think that might be managed, mum," he said in a tone that showed her he was endeavouring to hide his gladness. "Oh, yes, I think that could be managed. There is certainly a young woman in the hall," and he stopped. Mrs. Conway helped him. "I may tell you, Mr. Johnson, that the foreman hinted to Mr. Tallboys that he thought you and the upper housemaid were likely one of these days to come together, and that it is principally why we spoke to you, instead of to one of the others who were there. We thought, you see, that she might probably be leaving her place one of these days, and that perhaps this £25 might enable you and her to marry earlier than you otherwise would have done. In that case, you see, it would suit us both. You and she would, moreover, have the satisfaction of knowing that you were aiding to right a great wrong, and to restore to those who have been defrauded the property Mr. Penfold intended for them. So what do you say?" "Well, ma'am, I think that, as you say, it'd be doing the right thing, and I don't deny that Martha and I have agreed to wait a year or two till we could save up enough between us for me to start on my own account. For as long as I'm a journeyman and liable to lose my work any day, I would not ask her to come to me. But what with what we've laid by and this money you offer, I think we might very well venture," and his radiant face showed the happiness the prospect caused him. "Very well, then, we may consider that as settled," Mrs. Conway said. "What I want is for you to tell your Martha that she is to give notice to leave at once, and that if she has an opportunity she is to mention to Miss Penfold that she has a friend who is out of place at present, and whom she is sure will suit. Of course, as she will say that she is going to leave to be married, Miss Penfold cannot be vexed with her, as she might be otherwise, and may take her friend on her recommendation." "But suppose she shouldn't, ma'am?" and the young carpenter's face fell considerably at the thought. "Where would Martha be then?" "Oh, I shall pay the money, of course," Mrs. Conway said, "whether I get the place through her or not. I should think that Miss Penfold will very likely be glad to be saved the trouble of looking for another servant, but if not, I must try some other way to get the place." "What name am I to say her friend has?" "Let me think. Anne Sibthorpe." "But suppose she asks about where her friend's been in service, ma'am, and about her character?" "We'll settle that afterward. The first thing to do is for you to go over and see her, and ask her if she's willing to leave, and to do this." "I think I can answer for that, ma'am," the young carpenter said with a quiet smile. "Very well. Still, we had better have it settled. Will you go over today and see her? And then by tomorrow Mr. Tallboys and I will have talked the matter over and settled about the other points. Of course, you'll tell her not to give notice until she has heard from you as to what she is to say about me." "Very well, ma'am. I'll start at once." "I can arrange about the character," Mr. Tallboys said when they were alone. "I have a cousin in London to whom I shall write and explain the matter, and who will, I am sure, oblige me by writing to say that Anne Sibthorpe is all that can be desired as a servant, steady, quiet, industrious, and capable. Well, I really congratulate you, Mrs. Conway. At first I thought your project a hopeless one. Now I think you have every chance of success." Chapter 10. On Detachment. Ralph was soon at home in the regiment. He found his comrades a cheery and pleasant set of men, ready to assist the newly joined young officers as far as they could. A few rough practical jokes were played, but Ralph took them with such perfect good temper that they were soon abandoned. He applied himself very earnestly to mastering the mystery of drill, and it was not long before he was pronounced to be efficient, and he was then, at Captain O'Connor's request, appointed to his company, in which there happened to be a vacancy for an ensign. He had had the good luck to have an excellent servant assigned to him. Dennis Mulligan was a thoroughly handy fellow, could turn his hand to anything, and was always good-tempered and cheery. "The fellow's rather free and easy in his ways," Captain O'Connor told Ralph when he allotted the man to him, "but you'll get accustomed to that. Keep your whisky locked up, and I think you'll be safe in all other respects with him. He was a servant to Captain Daly, who was killed at Toulouse, and I know Daly wouldn't have parted with him on any account. His master's death almost broke Dennis's heart, and I have no doubt he'll get just as much attached to you in time. These fellows have their faults and want a little humouring, but take them as a whole, and I would rather have an Irish soldier servant than one of any other nationality, provided always that he's not too fond of the bottle. About once in 3 months I consider reasonable, and I don't think you will find Mulligan break out more frequently than that." Ralph never regretted the choice O'Connor had made for him, and found Dennis an excellent servant, and his eccentricities and the opinions which he freely expressed afforded him a constant source of amusement. A few days later Captain O'Connor came into his room. Pack up your kit. The company's ordered on detached duty, and there is an end to your dancing and flirting." "Well, I don't know about flirting," Ralph laughed. "As far as I can see, you do enough for the whole company in that way. But where are we going to?" "We are ordered to Ballyporrit, an out-of-the-way hole as a man could wish to be buried in. It seems that there are a lot of stills at work in the neighbourhood. The gauger has applied for military aid. A nice job we've got before us. I've had my turn at it before and know what it means. Starting at nightfall, tramping 10 or 15 miles over the hills and through bogs, and arriving at last at some wretched hut only to find a wretched old woman sitting by a peat fire and divil a sign of still or mash tubs or anything else. We start the first thing tomorrow morning, so you'd better get your kit packed and your flask filled tonight. We have 19 miles march before us and a pretty bad road to travel. I've just been into Desmond's quarters, and he's tearing his hair at the thought of having to leave the gaieties of Cork." "I think it's a nice change," Ralph said, "and shall be very glad to have done with all these parties and balls. Ballyporrit is near the sea, isn't it?" "Yes, about a mile away, I believe. Nearly 40 miles from here." The detachment marched next morning. Ralph enjoyed the novelty of the march, but was not sorry when at the end of the second day's tramp they reached the village. The men were quartered in the houses of the villagers, and the officers took rooms at the inn. Except when engaged in expeditions to capture stills, of which they succeeded in finding nearly a score, there was really not much to do at Ballyporrit. All the gentry resident within a wide circle called upon them, and invitations to dinners and dances flowed in rapidly. As one officer was obliged to remain always in the village with the detachment, Ralph seldom availed himself of these invitations. O'Connor and Lieutenant Desmond were both fond of society, and as Ralph very much preferred staying quietly in his quarters, he was always ready to volunteer to take duty upon these occasions. Ballyporrit lay within a mile of the sea, and Ralph, when he had nothing else to do, frequently walked to the edge of the cliffs, and sat there hour after hour watching the sea breaking among the rocks 300 or 400 feet below him, and the seabirds flying here and there over the water, and occasionally dashing down to its surface. A few fishing boats could be seen, but it was seldom that a distant sail was visible across the water, for not one vessel in those days sailed for the west to every 50 that now crossed the Atlantic. The rocks upon which he sat rose in most places almost sheer up from the edge of the sea, but occasionally they fell away, and a good climber could make his way over the rough rocks and boulders down to the water's edge. As, however, there was nothing to be gained by it, Ralph never made the attempt. Looking back over the land, the view was a dreary one. There was not a human habitation within sight. The hills were covered with brown heather, while in the bottoms lay bogs, deep and treacherous to those who knew not the way across. It was rarely that a human figure was visible. Once or twice a day a revenue man came along the edge of the cliff, and would generally stop for a talk with Ralph. "There was," he said, "a good deal of smuggling carried on along that part of the coast during the war. There's not so much of it now, though no doubt a cargo is run now and then. It does not pay as it did when the French ports were all closed, and there was not a drop of brandy to be had save that which was run over by the smugglers. Now that trade's open again, there's only the duties to save, and I fancy a good many of the boats have gone out of the business. You see, the revenue's got its agents in the French ports, and gets news from them what crafts are over there loading, and what part of the coast they come from. Along the English coast there's still a good deal of it. Their lace pays well, but there's not much sale for lace in Ireland, and not much sale for brandy either, excepting in the towns. The peasants and farmers would not thank you for it when they can get home-made whisky for next to nothing." "Oh, I suppose there is a good deal of that going on." "Oh, any amount of it, sir. For every still that's captured, I reckon there must be 100 at work that no one dreams of, and it'll be as long as barley grows, and there are bogs and hills all over the country, and safe hiding places where no one not in the secret would dream of searching. The boys know that we're not in their line of business, and mind our own affairs. If it were not for that, I can tell you I wouldn't go along these cliffs at night for any pay the king would give me, for I know that before a week would be out my body would be found some morning down there on the rocks, and the coroner's jury would bring in a verdict of tumbled over by accident, although there wouldn't be a man of them but would know better. Well, I am sure I don't want to find out anything about them. I belong to the detachment in Ballyporrit, and of course if the gauger calls upon us we must march out and aid him in seizing a still, but beyond that it's no affair of ours." And yet, although he so seldom saw anyone to speak to, Ralph had sometimes a sort of uncomfortable feeling that he was being watched. Once or twice he had caught a glimpse of what he thought was a man's head among some rocks, but on walking carelessly to the spot he could see no signs of anyone. Another time, looking suddenly round, he saw a boy standing at the edge of some boggy ground where the land dipped suddenly away, some 200 yards from the edge of the cliff. But directly he saw that he was observed, he took to his heels and speedily disappeared down the valley. Ralph did not trouble himself about these matters, nor did he see any reason why anyone should interest himself in his movements. Had he wandered about among the hills inland, he might be taken for a spy trying to find out something of the hidden stills. But sitting here at the edge of the cliff watching the sea, surely no such absurd suspicion could fall upon him. Had he been there at night, the smugglers might have suspected him of keeping watch for them, but smugglers never attempted to run their cargoes in broad daylight, and he never came down there after dark. One day a peasant came strolling along. He was a powerful looking man and carried a heavy stick. Ralph was lying on his back looking up at the clouds, and did not hear the man approach till he was close to him. Then with a quick movement he sprang to his feet. "Oh, I did not hear you coming," Ralph said. "You have given me quite a start." "'Tis a fine day, your honour, for sleeping on the turf here," the man said civilly. "I was not asleep," Ralph said, "though I own that I was getting on for it." "Is your honour expecting to meet anyone out here?" the man asked. "Sure it's a mighty lonesome sort of place." "No, I'm not expecting anyone. I have only come out for a look at the sea. I'm never tired of looking at that." "It's a big lot of water, surely," the man replied, looking over the sea with an air of interest, as if the sight were altogether novel to him. "A powerful lot of water, and I haven't heard them say that you often come out here." "Yes, I often do come out," Ralph assented. "Don't you think how it's dangerous and near to the edge of the cliff, your honour? Just one step and over you'd go, and 'twould be 10 chances to 1 that the next tide would drift your body away, and divil one know what had become of you." "But I don't mean to take a false step," Ralph said. "Sure, there's many a one takes a false step when he isn't dreaming about it, and if you didn't tumble over by yourself, just a push would do it." "Yes, but there's no one to give me a push," Ralph said. "Maybe and maybe not," the man replied. I don't say if I was a gentleman and could spend my time as I like that I would be sitting here on the edge of these cliffs where you might come to harm any minute." "I have no fear of coming to harm," Ralph answered, "and I should be sorry for anyone who tried. I always carry a pistol, not that I think there's any chance of having to use it, but it's always as well to be prepared." "It is that, your honour, always as well, but I don't think I should be always coming out here if I was you." "Well, why not, my good fellow? I harm no one and interfere with no one. Surely it's open to me to come here and look at the sea without anyone taking offence at it." "That's as may be, your honour. Anyway, I have told you what I think of it. Good morning to you." "Now I wonder what that fellow meant," Ralph said, looking after him. "He meant something, I feel certain, though what it is I can't imagine. I thought it was as well to let him know that I had a pistol handy, though he didn't look as if he intended mischief. I suppose after this I'd better not come here so often, though I have not the remotest idea in the world why I should annoy anyone more by standing here than I was standing on the cliff in front of Dover Castle. However, it certainly is a lonely place, and I should have precious little chance if 2 or 3 men took it into their heads to attack me here." "They are queer people, these Irish peasants of yours, O'Connor," Ralph said as they sat at dinner that evening. "What's the matter with them now, Conway? One can't even go and look at the sea from their cliffs without their taking it amiss." And Ralph related the conversation he had had with the peasant, adding that he was convinced he had been watched whenever he went there. "It is curious, certainly," the captain said when he had finished. "No doubt they think you are spying after something, but they would not trouble them unless there was something that they were afraid of your finding out. Either there has been something going on, or there is some hiding place down there on the face of the cliff, where maybe they have us still at work. Anyhow, I don't think I should neglect the warning, Conway. You might be killed and thrown over the cliff, and no one would be the wiser for it. I should certainly advise you to give up mooning about." "But there's nothing to do in this wretched village," Ralph said discontentedly. "Well, not if you stop in the village, I grant, but you might do as Desmond and I do when we are off duty. Go over and take lunch at the Ryans, or the Burkes, or any of the other families where we have a standing invitation. They're always glad to see one, and there's plenty of fun to be had." "That's all very well for you, O'Connor. You're a captain and a single man and one of their countrymen, with lots to say for yourself, but it's a different thing with me altogether. I can't just drop in and make myself at home as you do." Why, you are not shy, Conway?" O'Connor said in affected horror. "Surely such a disgrace has not fallen on His Majesty's 28th Regiment that one of its officers is shy. Such a thing is not recorded in its annals." "I'm afraid it'll have to be recorded now," laughed Ralph. for I own that I am shy, if you call shy feeling awkward and uncomfortable with a lot of strange people, especially ladies." "Do not let it be whispered outside," O'Connor said, "or the reputation of the regiment is gone for ever among Irish girls. Desmond, this is a sad business. What are we to do with this man? You and I must consult together how this thing is to be cured." "No, O'Connor," Ralph said earnestly, knowing how fond O'Connor was of practical jokes, and dreading that he and the lieutenant would be putting him in some ridiculous position or other. "You will never cure me if you set about it. I shall get over it in time, but it's the sort of thing that becomes 10 times worse if you attempt to cure it." "Oh, we must think it over, my lad," O'Connor said seriously. "This is a serious defect in your character, and as your commanding officer I consider it my bounden duty, both for your sake and that of the regiment, to take it into serious consideration and see what is to be done. You may never have such a chance again of being cured as you have here, for if a man goes away from Ireland without being cured of shyness, his case is an absolutely hopeless one. Desmond, you must turn this matter seriously over in your mind, and I will do the same. Oh, and now it's time for us to be starting for the dance at the Regans. I'm sorry you can't go with us, Desmond, as you are on duty." "I shall be very glad to take your duty, Desmond," Ralph said eagerly. "I told you so this morning, and I thought you agreed." "As your commanding officer," O'Connor said gravely, "I cannot permit the exchange to be made, Mr. Conway. You have your duty to perform at the regiment as well as Mr. Desmond, and your duty clearly is to go out and make yourself agreeable. I am surprised, after what I have just been saying, that you should think of staying at home." "Well, of course, if you want me to go, I'll go," but Ralph said reluctantly, "but I don't know the Regans, and don't want to." "That is very ungracious, Conway. Mr. Regan is a retired pork merchant of Cork. He has given up his business and bought an estate here, and settled down as a country gentleman. They say his father was a pig driver in Waterford. That's why he's bought a place on this side of the county. But people have been rather shy of them, because though he could buy 3/4 of them up, his money smells of pork. Still, as the election is coming on, they've relaxed a bit. He's got the militia band, and there'll be lashings of everything, and his girls are nice girls, whether their father sold pork or not, and it would be nothing short of cruel if we, the representatives of His Majesty's army, did not put in an appearance, especially as we have doubtless eaten many a barrel of his salt pork at sea. So put on your number 1 coatee and let's be off." With a sign Ralph rose to carry out his orders, and he would have been still more reluctant to go had he observed the sly wink that passed between his captain and lieutenant. "You know, he's quite refreshing, that boy," O'Connor said as the door closed behind Ralph. "That adventure in the West Indies shows he has plenty of pluck and presence of mind, but he's as shy as a girl. Though I don't know why I should say that, for it's mighty few of them have been any shyness about them. He'll grow out of it. I was just the same myself when I was his age." Lieutenant Desmond burst into a roar of laughter. "I should have liked to have known you then, O'Connor." O'Connor joined in the laugh. "Oh, it's true enough, Desmond. I was brought up by 2 maiden aunts in the town of Dundalk, and they were always bothering me about my manners, so that though I could hold my own in a slanging match down by the riverside, I was as awkward as a young bear when in genteel company. They used to have what they called tea parties, and a fearful infliction they were, and I was expected to hand round the tea and the cakes and make myself useful. I think I might have managed well enough if the old women would have let me alone, but they were always expecting me to do something wrong, and I was conscious that whatever they were doing they had an eye on me. It's very trying, you know, when you hear exclamations like this, 'The saints preserve us, if he hasn't only poked his elbow into Mrs. Fitzgerald's eye,' or 'See now, he isn't standing on Mrs. McCrea's train.' One day I let a cup of coffee fall onto old Mrs. O'Toole's new crimson silk dress. It was the first she had had for 9 years to my knowledge, and would have lasted her for the rest of her natural life, and if you could have heard the squall she made, and the exclamations of my aunts, and the general excitement over that wretched cup of coffee, you would never have forgotten it. It had one good result. I was never asked to hand things round again, and was indeed never expected to put in an appearance until the tea things were taken away. I suffered for months for that silk dress. My aunts got 2 yards of material and presented them to Mrs. O'Toole, and for weeks and weeks I got short allowance of butter in my bread and no sugar in my tea, and had to hear remarks as to the necessity for being economical. As for Mrs. O'Toole, she never forgave me, and was always saying spiteful things. But I did get even with her once. One evening the doctor, who was her partner at whist, was called out, and I was ordered to take his place. Now, I played a pretty good game at whist, better than the doctor did by a long chalk, I flattered myself, but I didn't often play at home unless I was wanted to make up a table, and very glad I was to get out of it, for the ill temper of those old harridans when they lost was something fearful. It was only penny points, but if they'd been playing for £5 they couldn't have taken it more to heart. And, of course, if I had the misfortune of being their partner, they put it down entirely to my bad play. Well, we held good cards, and at last we only wanted the odd trick to win. I held the last trump. Mrs. O'Toole was beaming as she led the best spade, and felt the game was won. I could not resist the temptation, but put my trump on her spade, led my small card, and the game was lost. Mrs. O'Toole gave a scream and sank back in her chair almost fainting, and when she recovered her breath and her voice went on like a maniac, and had a desperate quarrel with my aunts, I made my escape, and 3 days later, to my huge delight, was sent off to Dublin and entered the university. I only stayed there about 6 months when a friend of my father's got me a commission, but that 6 months cured me of my shyness. I'm not surprised, Desmond laughed. It can only have been skin deep, I fancy, O'Connor. I'll give Conway his first lesson tonight, the captain said. Dancing had already begun when Captain O'Connor and Ralph drove up in a dog-cart to the Regans, who lived some 4 miles from Ballyporrit. O'Connor introduced Ralph to his host and then hurried away. In a short time he was deep in conversation with Miss Tabitha Regan, who was some years younger than her brother and still believed herself to be quite a girl. She was gorgeously arrayed, with a plume of nodding feathers in her headdress. "You are looking splendid tonight, Miss Regan," O'Connor said in a tone of deep admiration. "You do not give your nieces a chance." "You're flattering me, Captain O'Connor." "Not at all, Miss Regan. It's quite a sensation you make. My young friend Conway was tremendously struck with your appearance, and asked me who that splendid woman was." Which was true enough, except for the word splendid, for as they had walked through the room, Ralph's eyes had fallen upon her, and he had exclaimed in astonishment, "Who on earth is that woman, O'Connor?" "He is dying to be introduced to you. He is a little young, you know, but of good family, and may come into a lot of money one of these days. Only son and all that. May I introduce him?" "How you do go on, Captain O'Connor," Miss Tabitha said, much flattered. "By all means introduce him." O'Connor made his way back to Ralph. "Come along, Ralph. I'll introduce you to our host's sister, Miss Regan. Charming creature and lots of money. Awfully struck with your appearance. Come on, man, don't be foolish." And hooking his arm in Ralph's, he led him across the room to the lady Ralph had before noticed. "Miss Regan, this is my brother officer, Mr. Conway. Ralph, this is Miss Regan, our host's sister, and although you would take her for his daughter, Miss Regan, Mr. Conway is most anxious to have the pleasure of the next dance with you, if you are not engaged." Ralph murmured something in confirmation, and Miss Regan at once stood up and placed her hand in his arm. Ralph gave a reproachful glance at his captain as he moved away. Fortunately he was not called upon to say much, for Miss Regan burst out, "It is too bad of you not having been here before, Mr. Conway. Quite rude of you. Captain O'Connor has spoken of you frequently, and we girls have been quite curious to see you. Ah, there is the music striking up. I think we had better take our places. I suppose as I am at the head of my brother's house we had better take the place at the top." Ralph never forgot that dance. Miss Regan danced with amazing sprightliness, performing wonderful steps. Her ostrich plumes seemed to whirl round and round him. He had a painful feeling that everyone was grinning, and a mad desire to rush out of the house and make straight for his quarters. "Your aunt is going it," Captain O'Connor remarked to one of the daughters of the house with whom he was dancing. "She sets quite an example to us young people." The girl laughed. "She is very, very peculiar, Captain O'Connor, but it is cruel of you to laugh at her. I do wish she wouldn't wear such wonderful headdresses, but she once went to court a good many years ago at Dublin, and somebody told her that her headdress became her, and she has worn plumes ever since." "Oh, I am not laughing at her, Miss Regan," O'Connor said gravely. "I am admiring her. Conway is doing nobly too." "I think he looks almost bewildered," the girl laughed. "It's a shame, Captain O'Connor. I was standing quite close by when you introduced him, and I could see by your face that you were playing a joke upon him." "I was performing a kindly action, Miss Regan. The lad's young and a little bashful, and I ventured to insinuate to your aunt that he admired her." "Well, she shall introduce him to me next," the girl said. "I like his looks." Shall I tell him that, Miss Regan? If you do, I'll never speak to you again." As soon as the dance was over, Captain O'Connor strolled by with his partner to the spot where Miss Tabitha was fanning herself violently, Ralph standing helplessly alongside. "That was a charming dance, Miss Regan. You surpassed yourself. Let me recommend a slight refreshment. Will you allow me to offer you my arm? Miss Regan, allow me to introduce my brother officer, Mr. Conway." Ralph, who had not caught the name, bowed to the girl thus left suddenly beside him, and offered her his arm. "Why, you look warm already, Mr. Conway," she began. "Warm is not word for it," Ralph said bluntly. "Did you see that wonderful old lady I've been dancing with? That is my aunt, Mr. Conway, but she is rather wonderful all the same." Ralph had thought before that he was as hot as it was possible for a man to be, but he found now that he was mistaken. I beg your pardon," he stammered. "I did not catch your name, but of course I oughtn't to have said anything." "I wonder you didn't see the likeness," the girl said demurely. "My aunt considers there is a great likeness between us." "I am sure I cannot see it the least bit in the world," Ralph said emphatically. "Not the smallest. No, but I hope you forgive me for that unfortunate remark. But the fact is I feel a little bewildered at the time. I'm not much of a dancer, and your aunt is really so energetic that I had to exert myself to the utmost to keep up with her." "I think you did admirably, Mr. Conway. We quite admired you both. There," she said, laughing at Ralph's confusion, "you need not be afraid of my not forgiving you for the remark. Everyone knows that Aunt Tabitha and we girls never get on very well together, and she does make herself dreadfully ridiculous, and I think it was too bad of Captain O'Connor putting you up with her." "Thank you, Miss Regan," Ralph said earnestly. "The fact is I haven't joined long, and I don't care much for parties. You see, I've only just left school, just a few months ago, and I haven't got accustomed to talking to ladies yet, and O'Connor, who's always up to some fun or other, did it just to cure what he calls my shyness. However, I can quite forgive him now." "I don't think you're so very shy, Mr. Conway," Miss Regan said with a smile. "That last sentence was very pretty, and if I had not hold of your arm I should make you a curtsy." "Oh, no, please don't do that," Ralph said, colouring hotly. I don't mean anything, you know." Now, don't spoil it. You meant, I suppose, what was quite proper you should mean, that Captain O'Connor, by introducing me to you, had made up for his last delinquency." "Yes, that's exactly what I did mean," Ralph agreed. "Captain O'Connor tells me that you have been through all sorts of adventures, Mr. Conway. Been carried off by a French privateer, and taken to a pirate island, and done all sorts of things." "The all sorts of things did not amount to much, Miss Regan. I made myself as useful as I could, and picked up French, and at last, when the privateer sailed away, I walked down to the shore and met our sailors when they landed. There was, I can assure you, nothing in any way heroic about the part I had to play." "Still, it was an adventure." "Oh yes, it was that, and upon the whole I think I liked it, except when there was a chance of having a fight with our own people." "That would have been dreadful. What would you have done?" "Well, I certainly wouldn't have fought, but what I should have done would, I suppose, have depended upon the circumstances. I suppose I should have jumped overboard if I had had the chance." "And is it true that Captain O'Connor was saying that you had to do like the other pirates on the island?" "Well, I don't know that there was anything particular they did except to get drunk, and I didn't do that. He hinted that the rule was that each man had to take a wife from the people they captured." "What nonsense!" Ralph exclaimed indignantly. "The idea of my taking a wife! You mustn't believe what Captain O'Connor says, Miss Regan. Except, of course," he added shyly, "when he is saying pretty things to you." "I think you'll do, Mr. Conway," the girl laughed. "6 months in Ireland, and you'll be able to give Captain O'Connor points if you go on as well as you're doing. You've paid 2 very nicely turned compliments in 10 minutes. But there, our dance is finished." "May I have another later on, Miss Regan?" "Yes, let me see. I'm engaged for the next 5. You can have the 6th if you like, if you haven't secured my aunt for that." "You're getting on, Conway," Captain O'Connor said as they drove away from the Regans. "I've had my eye on you. 3 dances with Polly Regan, beside taking her down to supper." "It was too bad of you putting me on to her aunt in that way." O'Connor laughed. "It was a capital thing for you, youngster, and paved the way for you with Polly, who, by the way, is not such a respectful niece as she might be, but she is a very nice little girl. I had thought of making up in that quarter myself, but I see it's no use now." "Oh, none at all," said Ralph seriously. "We're not actually engaged, you know, but I think we understand each other." What?" Captain O'Connor exclaimed in a changed voice. "You are not such a young ass as to get engaged before you join 3 months." Ralph burst into a laugh. "That's good," he said. "It is not often I get a rise out of you, O'Connor." "Well, you did there fairly," the captain admitted, joining in the laugh. "I thought for a moment you were serious." "No," Ralph said. "I may make a fool of myself in other directions, but I don't think I am likely to in that sort of way." "Ah, prior attachment, eh?" Captain O'Connor asked quizzically. "That's a secret, O'Connor," Ralph laughed. "I am not going to lay my heart bare to such a mocker as you are." When they reached the village they found a body of 20 men drawn up opposite their quarters. "Is that you, O'Connor?" the lieutenant asked as the trap stopped. "Just after you had gone the gauger came in and requested that a party might accompany him at 3 o'clock this morning to hunt up a still among the hills. I'm glad you're back in time, as I did not like going away without there being anyone in charge here. It's a nuisance, for it's just beginning to rain. However, it can't be helped." "I'll go if you like, Desmond," Ralph said, jumping down. "I should like a good tramp this morning after that hot room." "Are you quite sure you'd like it?" the lieutenant asked. "Oh, quite sure. Besides, it's my turn for duty this morning, so that really it's my place to go with him, if Captain O'Connor has no objection." "Oh, not in the least in the world, Conway. I don't suppose Desmond has any fancy for tramping among the hills, and if you have, there's no reason in the world why you should not go." A couple of minutes sufficed to exchange the full dress regimentals for undress uniform, covered by military greatcoat, and then Ralph hurried out just as the excise officer came up. "We're going to have a damp march of it, Mr. Fitzgibbon," Ralph said. "All the better, sir. There will be a thick mist in the hills that will hide us better even that night. There is a moon at present, and as likely as not they will have a boy on watch. Are you ready, sir?" "Quite ready." "Tit, hut! Form fours. March!" And the little party started. "How far are we going?" Ralph asked the revenue officer. "About 7 miles, sir. It's about 3:30 now. We shall be there somewhere around 6. It does not begin to be light until 7, so there's no particular hurry." "I hope you know the way, Mr. Fitzgibbon. It's so dark here I can scarcely see my hand, and if we get into the fog you talk about it will be as black as ink." "Oh, I know the way," the officer said confidently. "We keep along the road for 2 miles, then turn up a track leading up a valley, follow that for 3 miles, then branch to the right, cross over 1 or 2 slight rises, and then follow another slight depression till we are within 100 yards of the place. I could find my way there with my eyes closed." "Well, that sounds easy enough," Ralph said, "but I know how difficult it is finding one's way in a fog. However, we must hope we shall get there all right. Sergeant, have the men got anything in their haversacks?" "Yes, sir. Captain O'Connor ordered them to take their breakfast ration of bread, and he told me to see that their water bottles were filled, and here he moved closer up to Ralph so that he should not be heard by the men. "He gave me a couple of bottles of whisky to mix with the water, and told me to fill the bottles myself, so that the men shouldn't know what was in them until they'd had their breakfast. Otherwise there'd be none left by the time they want to eat the bread. He's always thoughtful, that captain is." "Now that's a very, very good plan, Sergeant. I shall bear it in mind myself for the future. They will want something before they get back after a 14-mile march." The fine mist continued steadily as they tramped along, but the night seemed to grow darker and darker. They turned off from the road, and as they began to ascend the track along the valley, the cloud seemed to settle round them. The excise officer walked ahead, keeping upon the path. Ralph followed as closely as he could in his footsteps, but although almost touching him, he could not make out his figure in the dark. "Tell the men to follow in single file, Sergeant," he said, "keeping touch with each other. As long as we are on the beaten track we know we're right, but there may be boulders or anything else close by on one side or the other." Marching as closely as they could to each other, the party proceeded. "How on earth are you going to find the place where we turn off, Mr. Fitzgibbon?" Ralph asked. "We shall find it easy enough, sir. The path regularly forks, and there's a pile of stones at the junction, which makes as good a guide as you can want on a dark night. We can't miss that even on a night like this." Ralph had struck a light with his flint and steel, and looked at his watch at that point where they turned off from the road, and did the same thing 2 or 3 times as they went along. "It's an hour and 20 minutes since we turned off, Mr. Fitzgibbon. Even allowing for our stoppages when we have gotten off the path, we ought to be near the turning now." "Yes, I fancy we're not far off now, sir. I can feel that we're rising more sharply, and there is a rise in the last 100 yards or so before we reach the place where the road forks. We'd better go a little more slowly now, sir." Another 5 minutes. There was a stumble and a fall in front of Ralph. "Halt!" he exclaimed sharply. "What is it, Mr. Fitzgibbon?" "I've fallen over the pile of stones," the officer said, "and hurt myself confoundedly." "Don't you think you'd better halt till daylight?" "Oh, I think we can keep on, sir. The nearest we get the better. And if we should miss the path we can halt then and wait till daybreak." Well, I suppose we can do that," Ralph agreed. "I'll go on ahead, sir, 20 or 30 yards at a time, and then speak, and you can bring the men on to me. Then I'll go on again. It'll be slow work, but I can keep the path better if I go at my own pace." Ralph agreed, and they proceeded in this manner for some time. "I don't think we're on the track now," Ralph said at last. Oh, yes, we are," the officer replied confidently. Ralph stooped and felt the ground. "The grass is very short," he observed, "but it is grass." The officer followed his example. "Oh, it's only a track now," he said, "just a footpath, and the grass is not worn off. I'm convinced we are right." "Well," Ralph said, "just go a little way to the right and left and see if the grass gets longer. It seems to me all the same." The officer did so, and was obliged to own that he could not perceive any difference. Ralph now spread his men out in a line and directed them to feel on the ground to see if they could discover the track. They failed to do so, and Ralph then ordered them together again. "We will halt here, Sergeant, till daylight. It's no use groping about in the dark. For anything we know we may be going exactly in the wrong direction. The men can, of course, sit down if they like, and they may as well eat a piece of bread and try their water bottles, but tell them not to eat more than half their ration. We may be longer before we get out of this than we expect." The order was given. The men piled their arms and seated themselves on the short turf. Presently Ralph heard a sudden exclamation of surprise and satisfaction as one of the men tasted the contents of his water bottle, and in a minute there was a buzz of talk. Before scarce a word had been spoken, the men had been marching in a sort of sulky silence, disgusted at being taken from their beds to work they disliked, and at their long march through the damp air, but their satisfaction at this unexpected comfort loosened their tongues. Pipes were produced and lighted, and the discomfort of the situation altogether forgotten. Desmond had handed to Ralph the flask and packet of sandwiches he had prepared for himself, and he too felt less strongly the chilling effects of the damp and darkness after partaking of them. The excise officer had also made his preparations. "We should be more certain as to our whereabouts if we had stopped at that heap of stones as I proposed, Mr. Fitzgibbon." "I don't deny, sir, you were right as it turned out, only I wouldn't have believed that I could have missed the path, and I did want to get close to the place before we were observed. I knew that we couldn't actually surprise them till morning, for the hut lies some distance in a bog, and there would be no crossing it unless we could see. Still, if we could have got to the edge without the alarm being given, they would not have had time to hide the things before we reached them. I have ridden across this place many a time after dark, and never missed my way." "Well, that was the sagacity of your horse more than your own, I expect," Ralph said. "A horse can find his way along a path that has once travelled better than any man can do. In the first place, I think he can see better in the night, and in the second he has some sort of instinct to guide him. However, I don't suppose it much matters. We shall find the path easily enough in the morning, and, as you say, the mist will hide our movements quite as effectually as the darkness would do." At last the morning began to break in a dim misty light, and as it grew stronger they were able to perceive how dense was the fog that surrounded them. At 3 paces distant they were invisible to each other. "It does not seem to me that we are much better off than we were before, so far as finding where the path lies. What do you think?" "Well, it looks bad, certainly," the officer admitted reluctantly. "I'm awfully sorry I've led you into this mess." "It can't be helped," Ralph said. "We must make the best of matters. At any rate, it's better than it was, and the mist is not nearly as heavy as when we were marching up that valley." Chapter 11. Still hunting. "Now, Sergeant, the men may as well fall in," Ralph said cheerfully, "and then we'll set about finding this path. On which side do you think it's most likely to lie, Mr. Fitzgibbon?" "I really can't give an opinion, sir. You see, there's not a breath of wind to help us, and in this sort of light there's no telling where the sun is, so I don't know at the present moment which way we're facing." "Well, we'll try to the right first, Sergeant. I'll lead the way. Let the men follow at a distance of about 10 paces apart. I'll keep on speaking. Do you stand at the left of the file, and when the last man has gone 10 paces from you, pass the word along. By that time I shall be about 200 yards away. If I have not found the path, then we will come back to you and do the same thing on the left. If we don't light upon the path itself, we may come upon some rise or bog or something that will enable Mr. Fitzgibbon to form an idea as to where we are." This was done, but beyond finding that the ground on the right was higher than that on the left, no index as to their position was discovered. "You see, Mr. Fitzgibbon, we're on sloping ground rising to the right. Now, does that help you at all?" "Not much, sir. The country here is all undulating." "Very well, then, we must try a march forward. Now, Sergeant, place the men 5 paces apart. Do you put yourself in the centre. I'll move on 3 yards ahead of you. I shall go as straight forward as I can, but if you think I am inclining either to the right or to the left, you say so. The fact that the ground is sloping ought to be a help for us to keep straight. I wish it sloped a little more, then one would be able to tell directly whether one was keeping straight. Let the men speak to each other every few paces so as to keep the right distances apart." Mr. Fitzgibbon placed himself by Ralph's side, and they started. For half an hour they kept on. Then Ralph cried, "Halt! I am certain I am going downhill. It may be because I have changed my direction, or it may be because there is a change in the lay of the ground. What do you think?" "It's impossible to say," Mr. Fitzgibbon replied. "It seemed to me that we have been going straight, but when one can't see a yard before one may have turned any direction." "How long do you think that this rascally fog is likely to last?" "Oh, it may clear up as the sun gets high, sir, but I must acknowledge that it may last for days. There's never any sign among these hills." "Well, at any rate, you must give up all idea of making a raid on this still, Mr. Fitzgibbon. That has become a secondary object altogether. What we have to do now is to find our way out of this. Hitherto I have tried what we could do in silence. Now I shall give that up. Now, Sergeant, get the men together again. I will go ahead, and shall, if I can, keep on descending. If one does that, one must get out of these hills at last. When I get about 50 yards I'll shout. Then you send a man on to me. When he reaches me I will shout again, and go on another 50 yards. When I shout, send another man forward. When he gets to the first man is to shout and then come on to me, and you send off another. In that way we shall make a regular line 50 yards apart, and I don't think anyone can get lost. Should anyone get confused and stray, which he can't do if he keeps his head, he must shout till he hears his shouts answered. After a time, if he doesn't hear any answer, he must fire his gun, and we must answer till he rejoins us. But if my orders are observed, I do not see how anyone can miss their way, as there will be posts stationed every 50 yards. You remain till the last and see them all before you. You quite understand? When each man comes up to the one in front of him, he is to stop until the next man joins him, and then move on to the man ahead." "I understand, sir." "They must not be in a hurry, Sergeant, because moving ahead as I shall have to move to the right or left sometimes, so as to make as sure as I can that I'm still going down. Now, Mr. Fitzgibbon, if you keep with me, between us we ought to find the road." The plan seemed a good one, but it was difficult to follow. The fall of the ground was so slight that Ralph and the officer often differed as to whether they were going up or down, and it was only by separating and taking short runs right and left, forward or backward, that they arrived at any conclusion, and even then often doubted whether they were right. The shouting as the long line proceeded was prodigious, and must have astonished any stray animals that might have been grazing among the hills. So bewildering was the fog that the men sometimes went back to the men behind them instead of forward to the men in front, and long pauses were necessitated before they got it right again. Ralph, finding the cause of the delays, passed the word down for the first man to keep on shouting "Number 1," the second "Number 2," and so on, as this facilitated matters. The line of shouting men had at least the advantage that it enabled Ralph to keep a fairly straight course, as the sound of voices told him if he was deviating much to the right or left. "We may not be going right," he said to his companion, "but at least we have the satisfaction of knowing that we are not moving in a circle." After some hours' marching, Ralph, to his great delight, came upon a hill rill of water. "Thank goodness," he said, "we've got a guide at last. If we follow this we must get somewhere. We need not go on in this tedious way, but will halt here till all the men come up." It was half an hour before the sergeant arrived. "We've got a guide now, Sergeant, and can push on. I suppose you've no idea what stream this is, Mr. Fitzgibbon?" "Oh, not at present," the officer admitted. "There are scores of these little rills about. They make their way down from the bogs at the top of the hills, and there's nothing to distinguish one from the other." They now tramped on briskly, keeping close to the little stream. Sometimes the ground became soft and marshy, and it was difficult to follow its course, but they went straight on, and after 3 more hours' marching came upon a road that crossed the stream over a little culvert. There was a cheer from the tired men as they stood on hard ground again. "Now, the question is, shall we turn to the right or the left? For we have not the faintest idea as to the points of the compass. What do you say, Mr. Fitzgibbon?" "I should say that it's an even chance, but at any rate, whichever way we go, we're sure to come in time upon a hut or village, and be able to find out where we are." "Very well, then, we will take the right. Form forward, Sergeant. We shall get on better by keeping in step. Now, Sergeant, if any of the men can sing, let him strike up a tune with a chorus. That will help us along." There was a little hesitation, and then one of the men struck up a song, and with renewed life and energy they all marched along. It was nearly an hour before they heard the welcome sound of voices close by. Ralph halted his men and proceeded toward this sound, and then discovered what the fog had prevented them from seeing before, that they were passing through a village, the voices being those of some women who were brought to their doors by the sound of music, and who were somewhat puzzled at the, to them, mysterious sounds. "What place is this?" Ralph asked. "It's Kilmacnocket." "Bless me," Mr. Fitzgibbon replied, "we are 20 miles away from Ballyporrit if we're an inch." "Well, then, it's evident we can't get there today," Ralph said. "We must have come more than that distance since we halted in the night. Now, my good woman, I have a party of 20 men here, and we have lost our way in the hills, and must stop here for the night. How many houses are there in the village?" "There are 10 or 12, sir." "Well, that's all right, then. We must quarter 2 men on each. I will pay everyone for the trouble it will give, and for something to eat, which we want badly enough, for we have come at least 25 or 26 miles, and probably 10 more than that, and have had nothing but a bit of bread since we started." "That's heartily welcome you'll be, sir," the woman said, "and we'll all do the best we can for you." The men were now ordered to fall out. The sergeant proceeded with them through the village, quartering 2 men on each house, while Ralph went round to see what provisions were obtainable. Potatoes and black bread were to be had everywhere, and he also was able to buy a good-sized pig, which in a very few minutes was killed and cut up. "We have reason to consider ourselves lucky indeed," Ralph said, as he sat down with the excise officer half an hour later to a meal of boiled potatoes and pork chops roasted over a peat fire. "It's 4:30 now, and will be pitch dark in another half hour. If we'd not struck upon that stream we should have had another night out among the hills." Ralph's first measure, after seeing his men quartered in the village, was to inquire for a boy who would carry a message to Ballyporrit, and the offer of half a crown produced 5 or 6 lads willing to undertake it. Ralph chose one of them, an active-looking lad of about 15, tore out a leaf from his pocket-book and wrote an account of what had happened, and said that the detachment would be in by 2 o'clock on the following day. Then, directing it to Captain O'Connor or Lieutenant Desmond, whichever might be in the village, he gave it to the lad, who at once started at a trot along the road in the direction from which they had come. "He'll be there in 4 hours," Mr. Fitzgibbon said. "It's a regular road all the way, and I can't miss it even in the dark. It's lucky we turned the way we did, for although it was taking us farther from home, it was but 2 miles along the road here, while if we'd gone the right way it would have been 6 or 7 before we arrived at the next village." "I think we're lucky all round," Ralph said. "An hour ago, if anyone told us we were going to be sitting down at 4:30 to a hot dinner of pork and potatoes, we should have slain him as a scoffer. It would have seemed altogether too good to be true." Ralph had no difficulty in purchasing whisky, and he ordered the sergeant to serve out a tot to each man with his dinner, and another half an hour later, and by 7 o'clock there was scarcely one of the tired men who was not already asleep. The next morning they started at 8 o'clock, having had a breakfast of potatoes before they fell in. Ralph rewarded the peasants generously for their hospitality, and the men set off in high spirits for their tramp, reaching Ballyporrit at 2:30 in the afternoon. "You gave us a nice scare yesterday, Conway," was Captain O'Connor's greeting as they marched in. "When 12 o'clock came and you didn't come back, I began to think you must have lost yourselves, and a nice time we had of it till your messenger arrived at 8. It was no use sending out to look for you on the hills, but I went out with a party, with 2 or 3 men to guide us to the end of a valley, up which a path went. Beyond that there was no going, for one couldn't see one's hand. I stayed there an hour, firing off guns once a minute, and as there was no reply, I was sure that you must be a good distance off, wherever you were. So there was nothing to do but to come back and hope you'd found shelter somewhere. Come in, lad. I've got some hot lunch waiting for you. Come in, Mr. Fitzgibbon. It's lucky I didn't catch you yesterday. I should have considered it my duty to have hung you forthwith for decoying His Majesty's troops among the hills." "Well, Conway, you didn't bargain for all this when you offered to change places with me," Lieutenant Desmond said, when they were seated at table. "No, but now it's all over I'm glad I did change, in spite of the tramp we had. It's been an adventure, and besides, it was a good thing to learn how best to get out of a fog." "How did you manage, Conway?" Captain O'Connor asked. "For once lost in such a fog as that on those hills, there really does not seem anything to be done." Ralph related the various steps he had taken, and how eventually they had come upon running water and followed it down to a road. "Well, I really think you have done remarkably well, youngster. I shouldn't be surprised if we have some more tramps before us, for I had a letter this morning from the colonel saying that the fellow known as the Red Captain, a notorious scoundrel who's been with his gang committing all sorts of atrocities in Galway, has made the place too hot for him at last, and is reported to have made his way down to the south coast, somewhere in this direction, and we're ordered to keep a sharp lookout for him. He's an unmitigated ruffian and a desperate one. He's shot several constables who tried to capture him, and as he has 3 or 4 men with him nearly as bad as himself, I expect we shall have some trouble with him. There has been a reward of £100 for his capture for a long time, but so far without success. One man whom he suspected, rightly or wrongly, of intending to betray him, he killed by fastening the door of his cottage and then setting the thatch alight, and the man, his wife, and 4 children were burned to death." That evening, just as dinner was over, the sergeant came in and said that a woman wished to speak to the captain. "Oh, what does she want, Sergeant?" "She won't say what she wants, sir, only that she wishes to speak to you privately." "Show her in then, Sergeant." The sergeant brought in the woman and then retired. As soon as the door closed behind him, the woman threw back the shawl which had hitherto almost covered her face. She was about 25 years old and strikingly pretty. "Oh, what can I do for you?" Captain O'Connor asked. "The sergeant says you wish to speak to me on some particular business." "Yes, sir, sure, and it's a very particular business." "You don't wish to speak to me quite alone, I suppose?" O'Connor asked, seeing that she hesitated. "No, your honor. Seeing that these gentlemen are all officers, there is no reason in life why they should not hear what I have to say. But sure, sir, it's little my life would be worth if it were known outside these walls that I had been here. My name is Bridget Moore, sir, and I belong to County Galway. Well, your honor, there was a desperate villain, they call him the Red Captain, there. He was hiding in the hills for some time near the little farm my husband holds. We did not know who he was. How should we? But though he was hiding because the revenue officers were after him on account of a bit of a still or something of that kind. But we found out one day, when he'd been taking too much of the crater, and was talking big like, that he was the Red Captain. My Dennis was troubled in his mind over it. Of course he was not one to inform, but he'd had so much of the Red Captain and was doing that he was uneasy at the thought of having him as a neighbour. There wasn't one to pretend to be friendly when he wasn't, and the captain noticed it and took offence, and there were mighty high words between them. One night, your honour, he and his gang came down and broke in the door and told Dennis he was a black-hearted informer. Dennis said it was a lie, and they were nigh shooting him, but at last they said he should have the choice either of joining them or being shot, and Dennis, being druv to it, seeing no other way to save his life, was forced to agree. Then the villains made him kneel down and take a great oath to be faithful and secret. I was a way off, for I had caught up the child and run out by the back door when they came in, but I crept round to a broken window there was, so that I could hear what was said. When they took him away with them and went off, I followed at a distance, for I wasn't sure whether after all they didn't mean to murder him. But they went up to the hut where they lived at the edge of the bog, and as they seemed more friendly like, I went back to see after the child, who was left all alone. The next morning I took it over to a neighbour and asked her to keep it till I came back. Then I went up to the hut again and found it was empty. A day or two after that I found out from a man who ran a still and knew the Red Captain well, that he'd made up his mind to leave Galway and come down south where he had some friends, so I just shut up the house and walked down here. Now, you know, your honour, that I don't come here for the sake of the reward. Not a penny of it would I touch if I were dying of hunger, and sooner than be pointed at as an informer I'd throw myself over them big rocks. But they have got Dennis, and either they'll make him as bad as themselves, which I don't think, or they'll shoot him, and if they don't shoot him, he'll be shot himself one of these days by the soldiers. What I want you to promise, your honour, is that if I point out where you can lay your hands on the villains, you won't say who told you, and that you'll tell your soldiers not to shoot Dennis. You'll know him easy enough, your honour, for he's a decent-looking boy, and when the time comes, you'll find he'll do what he can to help you. I found out who the people were that the Red Captain had come down to, and I watched and watched their place till one day I saw him come there. Then I followed him and found out whereabout they were hiding. I kept about till that evening. I had a chance of speaking to Dennis for a minute. He's broken-hearted, your honour, but he daren't leave them. He said they had sworn if ever he tried to run away they'd hunt him down, and the Red Captain said that he'd send information to the police that it was Dennis who helped him fire the hut when those poor creatures were burned, and would say he had been in the thick of it all along, and how could he prove the differ? So he daren't for the life of him move, your honour, and told me to keep away and go home, for I could do him no good, and if they caught me speaking to him, they'd kill the two of us. I promise you, willingly, Captain O'Connor said, I will not say who pointed out their hiding place, and if your husband does not join in the resistance, he certainly shall receive no hurt. If he is caught with them, I am afraid that I shall be exceeding my duty in letting him go, but surely he would have no difficulty in proving that he had only accompanied them in consequence of their threats. That's what he couldn't prove, sir. It's just what they told him. If they were caught themselves, they'd know there was no chance for them, and they'd all swear together that he'd been with them all along, and how could the boy prove that he wasn't? Well, Mrs. Moore, I will try and strain a point, Captain O'Connor said. You see, people sometimes escape after they are taken, and I think we shall be able to manage somehow that Dennis shan't appear at the bar with the others. And if it should turn out that cannot be managed, I will engage to make such representations to the authorities that your husband shall get off free. Very well, sir. Then I'll tell you where they are to be found. I can't take you there, your honour, but I can tell you whereabout it is. There's a footpath turns off from the road at the end of the village, and goes straight down to the top of them big rocks that comes out of the sea. Well, sir, a few 100 yards to the right of that, there's a sort of a break in the rocks, and there's a track goes down there. You won't see it unless you look close to it, and gets lost a little way down, because the rocks are all broken about and heaped on each other. It's down there they go. There's always a man on watch not far from the top, and there's generally a gossoon from their friends here somewhere at the edge of the bog behind, who would run forward and tell the man on watch if he saw any soldiers coming from here. So you'll have to be mighty careful, but they are down there, sure enough, somewhere. Dennis told me there was no chance of their being taken. They got a little boat hid away down among the rocks by the water, and if the alarm was given, they'd make off in that. I can't tell you any more than that, your honour, but I should think that may be enough to help you find them. Oh, I should think so too, Mrs. Moore. And what do you propose doing yourself? I shall go off, sir, at once. Folk have been wondering at me and asking where I come from and what I was doing here, and I want to get away. If it came to the Red Captain's ears there was a woman about me, he might guess it was me, and if he did, he'd like enough shoot Dennis and make away. I can't say as I can do any good by stopping, and I may do harm. So I'll go over to Dunmanway and stop there till I hear what your honour has done. If I find Dennis has got hurted, I shall come back. If not, I shall go home to the farm. Maybe your honour will tell him I shall be expecting him there. Captain O'Connor accompanied her outside to see that no one spoke to her, and when he saw her disappear in the darkness, he returned to the room. I think you've had a lucky escape, Conway, he said as he entered. The matter is explained now about your being watched and questioned, and it's very lucky that they did not quite make up their minds you were a spy, for if they had, you may be sure that they would have had no more hesitation in putting an ounce of lead into you, throwing you over the cliff, than they would in shooting a sparrow. Well, this is an important piece of news. The authorities have for a long time been trying to lay their hands on this scoundrel and his gang, and if we can catch them, it'll be a feather in our caps, for he has defied all their efforts for the last 3 years. Now, we must arrange the line of battle, how it is to come off, and when. In the first place, we must arrange with the Coast Guard to have a well-manned boat somewhere along the coast to cut the scoundrels off if they try to escape by sea. The attack must be made by daylight, that's evident, for half the men would break either their legs or their necks if they tried to get down in the dark. I think it would be best to place half the company along the top of the cliffs, posting 2 or 3 men at every point where it looks possible that they may ascend. Then with the other half we'll go down on this track she speaks of, and search the whole place thoroughly. If they're there, we must find them sooner or later, and find them we will if the search takes us a week. Who is this Red Captain? I believe his real name is Dan Egan. He was mixed up in some brutal outrage on an inoffensive farmer, had to leave the country, went to Dublin, and enlisted. He went out to Spain with his regiment, was flogged twice for thieving. Then he shot an officer who came upon him when he was ill-treating a Portuguese peasant. He got away at the time, and it was months before he was heard of again. It was thought that he had deserted to the French, but I suppose he got down to a port somewhere in disguise and shipped on board a vessel for England. The next heard of him, apparently, was that he was back again at his native place. The police here were, of course, ignorant as to what had become of him from the time he disappeared, but the fellow made no secret of what he had been doing, and boasted of having shot the officer. The regiment was communicated with, and by a comparison of the date of enlistment and the personal description, there was no doubt that the man who had enlisted as Mark Kelly was Dan Egan. Of course, every effort was made to capture him, but in vain. I believe the peasants would have informed against him, for he was hated for his violence and overbearing way, but he soon established a sort of terror in the district. He was joined by 3 or 4 of the greatest ruffians in County Galway, and unless the whole of these had been captured at one swoop, vengeance would be sure to fall upon whoever had betrayed him. He's killed 4 or 5 police officers at various times, and I should say twice as many peasants who have ventured to offend him. He and his band levied a sort of blackmail in the district, and woe betide the small farmer who refused to send in a sheep or a bag of meal once a month. Their cattle were killed and their ricks set on fire, and so in a short time he had the whole neighbourhood under his thumb. Whenever a party went in pursuit of him, he was sure to obtain early information, not from love but from fear, for it was a well understood thing that anyone seeing a body of police and failing to send instant word would in fact suffer for it. Now, just as we left, I heard that a company of foot and a troop of cavalry were to be sent from Galway to search every hut and hiding place in the district, and I suppose that it was this that drove him down here. He has red hair and beard, and it is this partly, and partly no doubt the fellow's murderous character, that has gained him the name of the Red Captain. He is a prize worth taking, and if we can lay hands on him and his band together, we shall have done better work than if we had unearthed 100 illicit stills. At any rate, we will lose no time. I'll write a letter at once to the revenue officer at the Coast Guard station. I shall mention no names, but say that we hope to make an important capture tomorrow morning on the cliffs there, and ask him to send a well-armed boat at daylight, with instructions to stop and arrest any boat that may put out from the shore. If the revenue cutter happens to be lying off his station or within reach of a messenger, I will tell him to have her off the coast as well. Captain O'Connor at once wrote the letter. "Sergeant Morris," he said, when the non-commissioned officer came in, "I want you to take this letter yourself to Lieutenant Adcock at the Coast Guard station in the Cove, 3 miles along to the east. It's of the highest importance. I want you to see the officer yourself and obtain an answer from him. Take a man with you and carry your sidearms. Don't go along the cliff, but keep to the road till you come to the lane that leads direct to the village in the Cove. Just tell the landlord to come here, will you?" "Landlord," he said, when the host appeared, "I want you to lend a couple of long greatcoats and 2 hats or caps of any kind. I'm sending 2 of my men off on a mission, and I don't want them to be noticed. It does not matter how old the coats are, so that they are long." "I'll get them, your honour. I have one that'll do, and will borrow the other for you in no time." "You see, Sergeant, I don't want your presence in the village to be noticed. You know how these fellows hang together. The sight of 2 soldiers in uniform there would be sure to attract attention. Choose a man you can rely on to play his part cleverly. I tell you to take your sidearms, because I happen to know that there are men about who, if they suspected your mission, would not have the least hesitation in knocking you on the head. This is no question of finding a still, Sergeant, but of making the capture of one of the most desperate bands in the country, and it's well worth taking the utmost pains and precaution to ensure everything going well." "I understand, sir. I'll take Pat Hogan with me. He has plenty of the brogue, and can talk the language too, so if anyone should speak to us as we go along, he can do the talking, and no one will suspect that we're not a couple of countrymen." "That will do very well, Sergeant. It's just 7 o'clock now. If Lieutenant Adcock is in when you get there, you ought to be back well before 10. It's about 4 miles by road. I'd borrow a couple of heavy sticks if I were you. I don't think it at all likely there'll be any occasion to use them, but it's just as well to be prepared. If when you get near the village, or on your way back, you come across anyone who questions you inquisitively, and seems to you to be a suspicious character, I authorize you to make him prisoner and bring him over with you. Knock him down if he attempts resistance. You may as well take a pair of handcuffs with you and a short coil of rope. The object of the rope is that if you capture anyone of your way to the village, you had better handcuff him, gag him, and tie him up securely to a tree or some other object at a distance from the road, and pick him up as you come back. I need hardly say that you are not to go into any house in the village, and not to speak to anyone beyond what is absolutely necessary." "I understand, sir, and you can rely upon me to carry out your orders." "You'd better fetch Hogan in here, Sergeant. Tell him what he has to do before you bring him in. Then we can see the disguise on you both, and it's better for you to start from an inn where people are going in and out than from one of the houses where you are quartered." The landlord returned with the disguises, and almost immediately after the sergeant had gone out, and in a few minutes the latter came in with Hogan. The greatcoats were put on, the hats substituted for military caps, and with the collars of the coats turned up and the addition of 2 heavy sticks, the disguise was complete, and the 2 smart soldiers would pass anywhere as peasants. "You'd better take your gaiters off, Sergeant. You look too neat about the feet, although that would probably not be noticed unless you went into the light. Here is the letter. Put it carefully inside your jacket. There, now. I think you will do." It was nearly 10 when the 2 soldiers returned. "Here's a letter, sir, from the revenue officer. He quite understands what's wanted, and will have a boat off the cliffs at daybreak with a well-armed crew. He does not know where the cutter is at present. She touched there 2 days ago, sailing west." "You met no suspicious characters, Sergeant?" "Oh, no, sir. We spoke to no one until we got to the village, beyond asking a woman which was the turning from the main road. There didn't seem to be a soul about in the village, and we had to wait about some time before I could get hold of a boy to tell me which was the revenue officer's cottage. I left Hogan outside when I went in, but he saw no one, nor did anyone speak to us on our return beyond 1 or 2 men we met passing the time of night, which Hogan answered." "All the better, Sergeant. The great object is secrecy. Now leave these things here and put on your caps again. If you go to the bar, the landlord has orders to give you a glass of grog each. Don't say a word as to where you've been, Hogan, but get back to your quarters. When you've had your grog, Sergeant, look in again before you go." When the men had gone out, Captain O'Connor opened the letter, which merely confirmed what the sergeant had said. When Sergeant Morris returned, Captain O'Connor told him that the company were to parade an hour before daylight. "Don't give the order tonight, Sergeant, but go round from house to house yourself in the morning, rouse the men, and tell them to fall in quietly, without beat of drum." "Everything is going on well, boys," he said when the sergeant had left, "and I think we have a good chance of laying these scoundrels by the heels tomorrow. However, we must ensure that the word is not sent from the village when the troops begin to get up. A stir an hour before the usual time is sure to excite remark, and as it's certain these fellows will have arranged with someone in the village for early news of any unusual movement, we must take steps to prevent a messenger passing. I propose that you 2 shall be astir half an hour before the troops, and that you shall, before anyone else is moving, go along the path leading to the cliffs, stop a couple of 100 yards beyond the village, and arrest anyone who may come along." "Yes, I think that would be a very good plan," Lieutenant Desmond said. "No one shall pass us, I warrant. Don't forget to take your pistols. It's likely enough you may have to use them before the day is over. These scoundrels know they fight with ropes round their necks, and are almost sure to resist desperately. Now we will have 1 glass more, and then be off to bed. The day will begin to break about 7, and I will impress upon the landlord the urgent necessity of calling you both by 5. "Oh, I suppose we're to stay where we take up our station till you come along with the company, O'Connor, whether we take any prisoners or not." Yes, I think that will be the best way, Desmond. If you have caught anyone, I will send them back with a guard to the village. No, it would not do for you to move before we came up, for there is no saying what time a messenger will go along. They may not take the alarm until just as we are starting, or even until they see which road we are taking. By the way, you may as well take that pair of handcuffs the sergeant has left on the table with you. Otherwise, if you do get a prisoner, you would have to keep your hands on his collar, or he might make a bolt any moment. There's nothing like being on the safe side. You'd better take up your post at some place where your figures will not be seen by anyone coming along the road till he is close to you, or instead of coming straight along, he might make a bolt round, and some of these fellows can run like hares. You must not let the smallest chance escape us. If we succeed in the affair, we shall get no end of credit, beside the satisfaction of freeing the country of as desperate a band of ruffians as any that infest it, and that's saying a good deal. Now, here's success to our work tomorrow." O'Connor drained his glass, placed it on the table, and then, rising and taking up his sword, made his way to his room, his companions at once following his example.